Chapter 1. The Law on the Frontier. The sun was just beginning its slow ascent over the vast untamed land, spilling golden light across the rolling plains. The sky, still heavy with the remnants of night, shifted from a deep indigo blue to soft shades of lavender and pale pink, painting a canvas of serenity. The first rays of daylight stretched across the rugged horizon, casting a warm glow that seemed to ignite the land into a new day. The frontier, raw and wild, stirred awake under the sun's touch, an untouched wilderness waiting to be tamed, its beauty both fierce and humbling. The wind whispered through the sagebrush that dotted the land in scattered clumps, their silvery gray leaves trembling as if caught in the soft breath of 1,000 years of solitude. A lone coyote's distant call echoed through the valley, a reminder that even in this desolate place, life endured. The distant hills, jagged and unforgiving, loomed like silent sentinels, guarding the secrets of the earth beneath their rocky surfaces. Farther still, where the land met the sky, the horizon disappeared into an endless expanse, an invitation to those bold enough to venture into its embrace. The only sounds, besides the soft rustle of wind, were the steady rhythm of hooves against the hard-packed earth, breaking the stillness like a heartbeat in the vast emptiness. A figure appeared on the horizon, a solitary rider on horseback, his silhouette framed by the emerging light. The horse's steady gait echoed against the backdrop of silence, its hooves kicking up small puffs of dust that swirled in the morning air, leaving a trail of footprints that would soon be swallowed by the wilderness. The rider, a man hardened by the years spent under the unrelenting sun and the weight of his responsibilities, sat tall in the saddle. His broad shoulders and weathered face bore the marks of a life lived in a world where survival came at a high price. His blue eyes, as sharp and clear as the morning sky above, scanned the land before him, unwavering in their focus. He was a man who had seen it all, the dust, the danger, and the decisions that shaped a man's soul. Sheriff Elias Macready had been riding since the first light of dawn, as he always did. The sunrise was a time of reflection, a quiet moment before the noise of the day took hold. He could feel the weight of the law pressing down on him, heavy and unyielding. The law was not just a badge pinned to his chest, it was the very air he breathed, the constant reminder of his duty to uphold order in a land where chaos often ruled. As his horse plodded steadily forward, Elias couldn't help but marvel at the land around him. There was something about the frontier that called to him, a raw beauty that both soothed and unsettled him. The vastness of it all, a land that stretched as far as the eye could see, untamed and free, was a place that bred men of both honor and lawlessness. It was a place where the law had to be more than just words on paper. It had to be a living, breathing force carved into the hearts of those who called this place home. The wind picked up slightly, sending a swirl of dust into the air, but Elias paid it no mind. His mind was focused on the road ahead, the town just beyond the next ridge. It was a small town, dusty, weathered, and as much a part of the frontier as the land itself. But it was home, and it was his to protect. A soft sigh escaped his lips, barely audible above the sounds of nature, as he pushed his thoughts aside. There would be time enough for doubts later. For now, there was only the journey and the promise that the law would ride with him as steadfast as the land beneath his boots. In the distance, the outlines of the town began to take shape, the buildings peeking through the haze of early morning heat. Elias could already hear the faint sounds of life, the creak of wooden doors, the murmur of voices drifting on the wind. It was a reminder that, for all the beauty of the wilderness, the world he was bound to was not so serene. It was a world filled with contradictions, hope and despair, order and chaos, good men and bad. And so, as the sun climbed higher and the town came into view, Elias Macready rode toward his destiny, knowing full well that every day on the frontier would demand more from him than the last. But the law was in his blood, as much a part of him as the land itself, and though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing remained true: he would meet it head-on, just as he had always done. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden light on the dusty plains below, and with it, Elias Macready rode on, a man of the law in a land that was anything but civilized. The town of Dunwood loomed just beyond the crest of the ridge, a scattered collection of wooden buildings clinging to the dry earth like weathered bones. The steady clip-clop of hooves on packed earth grew louder as Sheriff Elias Macready approached. His horse, a sturdy chestnut mare with a coat as dusty as its rider, carried him forward with the ease of a seasoned animal. The creature's hooves stirred up a cloud of fine gray dust that swirled and rose like a vapor in the dry morning air, drifting behind them in a trail as faint and fleeting as the memories of his past. Elias's gaze, intense and focused, swept over the town below him. He was a man who never lingered on sentiment, but there was something about the sight of the town, small, humble, and barely standing against the weight of the land, that made him pause, if only for a second. The simple fact that it still existed in this unforgiving corner of the frontier was a testament to the persistence of those who called it home. But he knew all too well that in a land like this, persistence was often matched only by danger. Dunwood, like so many others, had been shaped by the constant battle between law and lawlessness. His horse picked up its pace as the town drew nearer, the low hum of the wind making the dry branches of the few scattered trees creak and groan. Elias's eyes, pale blue and sharp, narrowed slightly, not out of concern but of preparation. Every small movement, every shift of the wind, every flicker of shadow, it all mattered in a place like this. His senses were honed as if the land itself had ingrained in him the need to stay alert. His face, weathered from years of exposure to the harsh sun, was set in a grim line. His mouth a thin slash of resolve beneath the dust of travel. His jaw was square and strong, his features carved from the same relentless elements that made the frontier both beautiful and brutal. At 32, Elias was a man whose age had come not through years of lived experience alone, but from the burdens he carried, the weight of justice in a place where it was often in short supply. The worn cowboy hat atop his head cast a shadow over his brow, the brim low enough to shield his eyes but high enough for the keen observer to catch a glimpse of the badge pinned to his chest. The sheriff's star, though dulled from constant use, still gleamed faintly in the morning light, a symbol of both honor and duty. The faded duster that hung from his broad shoulders rippled slightly with the wind, the leather worn and cracked from years of use but still strong. Beneath the coat, his vest and shirt, though plain and unadorned, spoke of a man who had little need for frills. His clothing was practical, as much a part of the rugged landscape as the dirt beneath his boots. The town came into sharper focus, its simple wooden buildings framed against the empty horizon. The saloon, the general store, and the livery stable were all standing in quiet defiance of the wild landscape that surrounded them. There was a certain resilience in the way the buildings stood, straight and steady, with a few signs of wear, but nothing that couldn't be mended. But Elias knew better than to be fooled by appearances. A town like this, with its creaky doors and narrow streets, was often a powder keg waiting to explode. The law, however fragile it was, had to be its spark. Elias' thoughts wandered to the larger challenge that lay before him, one that was as much internal as it was external. His position as sheriff was more than just a job, it was a calling, one that had cost him more than he cared to admit. The law wasn't something he could simply enforce with words or brute force. It was something that had to be lived, something that had to be woven into the very fabric of life in a town like Dunwood. He had seen too many men and women destroyed by their own desire for power, too many lives shattered by the chaos that ruled when justice was absent. He had promised himself long ago that he would be the man who stood against that tide, the man who fought to make right the wrongs he encountered. But as he approached the town, Elias couldn't deny the gnawing doubt that always lingered just beneath his resolve. Could he truly make a difference? Could the law stand firm against the growing unrest in this part of the frontier, where every man seemed to be his own law? The question had no easy answer. As he guided his horse down the last stretch of the road leading into town, Elias's mind continued to churn. Justice wasn't a simple thing. It wasn't a matter of right and wrong, good and bad. It was about balance, about knowing when to stand firm and when to bend. And in the frontier, where survival often depended on one's ability to adapt, that balance was always shifting. With a quiet exhale, Elias straightened in the saddle, focusing once more on the task ahead. There was no time for doubts now. The town was waiting and he had a job to do. He had made it this far, and no matter the odds, he wasn't about to turn back. The sounds of hooves on packed earth filled the air as his mare carried him into Dunwood, a small town in a vast, untamed land. The wind picked up again, a reminder that the frontier was always alive with change, and with that, Elias Macready rode into the town of Dunwood, his heart as steady as the rhythm of the hooves beneath him. The sounds of Dunwood stirred to life as Elias Macready rode into town, his arrival marked by the steady rhythm of hooves on the rutted dirt street. A hush seemed to fall over the square. The breath of the town held for a moment as its residents took in the sight of the sheriff. A mix of wary respect and tentative hope rippled through the gathering crowd, their faces reflecting the complicated emotions they always felt at the return of law in a place so often bruised by lawlessness. Elias had seen this kind of reaction before. It wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same in every town he rode into. Suspicion, curiosity, and the unspoken question of whether he was the man to put things right. Dunwood wasn't any different. It was a small town, worn at the edges but resilient at its core. There was no doubting that it had been through its fair share of trials, and like all frontier towns, it had a tendency to be a little bit wild and free. But it had also known the weight of good men making difficult choices. Elias could sense that it was a town waiting for something. Perhaps a shift in fate, perhaps something more. As he rode down the street, the townsfolk slowly began to resume their morning routines, exchanging quiet greetings with each other, their voices soft, like a series of whispered confessions. In the open air of the town square, the murmur of conversation mingled with the sounds of a blacksmith hammering at his forge and the clink of metal from the nearby livery. A child ran past, clutching a hoop, her giggles fading behind her as she disappeared down a side street. At the far end of the street, a small weathered shop with a hand-painted sign reading Miller's General Store caught Elias's attention. The elderly man who stood in front of the store, a tall, gaunt figure with silver hair and a face crisscrossed with wrinkles, watched Elias with a calm, appraising gaze. His name was Old Man Miller, and his reputation as a man of few words had long been established. But in the way he gave Elias a single nod, it was clear that he approved of the sheriff's return. His thin lips curved slightly at the edges, offering a silent acknowledgement that spoke louder than any words could. Elias gave the old man a brief nod in return, the exchange enough to convey the unspoken understanding between them. The sound of boots scraping on dirt caught his attention, and he turned to see Deputy Sam Curtis making his way toward him. Sam was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stony expression and a thick beard that framed his face like a mask. Despite his usually stoic demeanor, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of admiration that Elias had come to recognize in the faces of those who had served under him before. "Sheriff," Sam greeted him, tipping his hat with a subtle nod. "Good to have you back." Elias didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the faces around them, assessing the quiet tension in the air. The deputy's words were sincere, but there was an undercurrent of something else there. Perhaps concern, or maybe just the weight of expectation. "Anything that needs attention?" Elias asked, his voice low but steady, betraying no sign of his own apprehension. His eyes lingered on Sam, as if silently asking the man to read between the lines. "Nothing too urgent, Sheriff, just the usual. Folks are uneasy, but that's not new around here," Sam replied with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But I reckon they're glad to see you back. There's been talk about how things might change now." Elias's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of change. He didn't need to be told that change was coming. It always did, one way or another, but it never came without a price. A deep breath filled his chest as he gave Sam a curt nod. "Change is good," Elias said simply, his gaze sharpening with purpose, "if it's done right." The brief conversation ended as a wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd, and Elias felt the weight of their collective gaze. They watched him, this sheriff who had arrived back to them with a reputation that was both a shield and a burden. The weight of his responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy mantle, yet he bore it without faltering. As Elias walked his horse slowly toward the center of the town square, his eyes swept across the few familiar faces and the many new ones. Locals huddled in groups, exchanging quiet words and glances. They seemed uncertain, as though waiting for something to happen, for some kind of sign. Maybe they were waiting for a reason to believe in him, to trust that he could restore order to a place that had long since slipped into chaos. Maybe, Elias thought, they were waiting for someone to finally believe in them. He adjusted his hat and surveyed the scene with calm deliberation. The sun was climbing higher in the sky now, casting long shadows across the dirt street, and he could feel the day starting to press in around him. It was time to get to work. "Town's been quiet enough lately," he said, his voice carrying slightly in the open air. "But don't mistake quiet for peace. There's trouble brewing, and I won't let it fester. I'll be around to talk with anyone who needs to, but just remember this. We're all in this together. I can't do it alone. None of us can." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some faces softened with the quiet relief of hearing their sheriff's voice again. Others remained skeptical, but Elias didn't mind. Skepticism was a part of the frontier. It was earned, not given. As the townsfolk slowly began to disperse, Elias continued to stand at the center of the square for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the streets, settling on each person for a beat. There was much to be done, but for now the first step had been taken. The law was here, and it would not be moved. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a rich amber light over the rugged land that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. In stark contrast to the orderly town of Dunwood, this part of the frontier was wild and untamed, a land where the earth was as unforgiving as the people who dared to make it their home. A steady wind blew across the barren expanse, carrying with it the scent of dry dust and sagebrush. The air was thick with the heat of late summer, the earth cracked and parched beneath the fading daylight. Nestled among a series of jagged rocky outcroppings, a ramshackle camp seemed to grow out of the very land itself, like a shadowy remnant of a forgotten past. The campfire flickered and sputtered in the evening air, the orange glow casting a weak light on the weathered faces of the men and women who sat around it. They were the outcasts of the frontier, a group bound not by family or blood but by necessity and the freedom they had found in a life beyond the law. The fire crackled and popped, sending thin tendrils of smoke rising into the sky. A few sparse patches of dry grass swayed lazily in the wind, the only vegetation daring to survive in the harsh, unforgiving land. Above, the sky was a deepening blue, the stars beginning to emerge like distant beacons of cold, unreachable light. The distant sound of a coyote's lone call broke the silence, adding to the wild, raw sense of freedom that defined this place. The camp was small, no more than a few tents and a scattering of makeshift shelters pieced together from tarps, old boards, and scrap wood. A few worn saddles and horses tethered to nearby rocks stood idle, their coats gleaming faintly in the firelight. The horses were weary from days of travel, their eyes dull with exhaustion, yet the unmistakable strength and wildness of the frontier could still be seen in their broad, muscular frame. Around the campfire sat a tight-knit group of outlaws, their faces lit by the flickering flames that cast long shadows over their rugged features. They spoke in low murmurs, the words nearly lost in the rustling of the wind and the crackle of the fire. These were men and women who had learned to survive by whatever means necessary, outlaws, thieves, and drifters, their loyalty to one another born of circumstance rather than affection. One man, a tall figure with a grizzled beard and a weather-beaten face, leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he spoke in a gravelly voice. His eyes, dark and cold as the night sky, scanned the faces around him, each one set in a familiar expression of wariness and distrust. This was Roland, the leader of the group. His reputation had preceded him, ruthless and clever, always staying one step ahead of the law, always with a plan. A man who trusted no one and kept his cards close to his chest. "Tomorrow we ride," Roland muttered, his voice low but carrying in the quiet night. "There's money to be made, and I don't aim to let it slip through our fingers." The others around the fire exchanged looks, quick, knowing glances that held no need for elaboration. Life on the edge of civilization had taught them all to trust their instincts, to keep their movements swift and silent, like the shadows that cloaked them. They had long ago accepted that their freedom came at a price, and they paid it in ways others couldn't understand. A woman sitting near the fire, her hair long and wild, caught the edge of Roland's words. Her face, though young, was marked by a certain hardness, an understanding of what life had demanded from her. She was Lily, a name that many in the towns whispered in fear and curiosity. Her sharp green eyes, now reflecting the flames of the fire, were locked on Roland as he spoke. "You sure about this, Roland?" she asked, her voice quiet but with a weight of its own. "The law's breathing down our necks. It won't be long before they come looking for us again." Roland gave a short, dismissive laugh, the sound grating in the stillness of the night. "Let 'em come. We've outrun worse." He glanced around at the others, his eyes narrowing. "Besides, there's a bigger score at stake, and we're not about to let a little thing like a lawman stop us." The others shifted uneasily, though no one spoke up. They had all grown accustomed to Roland's bravado, but there was always the gnawing fear at the back of their minds that their luck might run out. Lily could feel it too, the weight of the law always hanging in the air, just out of reach but closing in with every passing day. A rustle came from the edge of the camp, and a man stepped forward, his face partially obscured by the shadows. It was one of their own, a young man, rough around the edges but loyal. His name was Jake, and he had spent too many years living on the run to ever forget the kind of danger they lived in. He had a quickness about him, a nervous energy that never seemed to leave him. He looked from Roland to Lily, his brow furrowed. "You really think this is it, Roland?" Jake asked, his voice tight with unease. "You know how close we're getting to the edge. I don't know if we can keep outrunning it." Lily didn't look at Jake, but she could feel the uncertainty radiating from him. They all had that same feeling, tired, worn down by endless days of riding, hiding, always watching over their shoulders. They had become experts at surviving, but surviving didn't always mean living. It was a life that had begun to wear thin on them all, especially Lily. There were moments, brief flashes of longing, when she remembered the life she had imagined for herself before she had fallen into this world of outlaws and shadows. She wasn't a stranger to the hard choices this life demanded. She had been born into it, raised in its chaos, and made the difficult decision to stay with it. But tonight, as the fire flickered and the murmurs of her companions swirled around her, Lily felt the weight of that decision settle heavier than it ever had before. This life was freedom, yes, but it was also danger. It was a life lived in the shadows, always one step ahead of the law, always looking over your shoulder, always waiting for the moment when the chase would end. But for now, there was the fire, the company, the raw, untamed land surrounding them. There was freedom, however fleeting, and that would have to be enough. The firelight flickered in the gathering dusk, casting shadows that danced across the weathered faces of the outlaws sitting around it. The world around them was quiet, the usual chatter muted as they prepared for whatever trouble the next day would bring. But amidst the low murmurs, there was a brief moment of stillness, a pause in the constant motion of their lives. From the edge of the camp, a figure stepped out from the shadows of a lean-to shelter, emerging into the soft glow of the firelight. Lily Dalton moved with a quiet grace, the long auburn strands of her hair catching the warmth of the flames as they tumbled down her back in loose waves. The firelight made her hair seem to glow, setting the russet strands alight with fiery hues. Her green eyes, sharp and piercing, looked out from beneath the sweep of her bangs, filled with a quiet intensity that made her seem both fierce and vulnerable all at once. She paused for a moment, standing at the edge of the circle of light, her gaze sweeping over the group of outlaws who, for the moment, seemed to have forgotten her presence. For a heartbeat, everything seemed to stand still. The crackle of the fire and the distant call of coyotes were the only sounds that filled the silence, wrapping the camp in a kind of uneasy peace. Lily's posture was relaxed but alert, as if she was waiting for something or someone to break the quiet. She folded her arms across her chest, the faded, weather-worn vest she wore stretching slightly over her lean form. There was a certain strength in her movements, a sense of purpose in the way she held herself, but it was tempered by the softness in her features, the hint of doubt that sometimes flickered across her face when she thought no one was looking. Her gaze turned inward, distant for a moment as the firelight reflected in her eyes. In the flickering orange glow, she looked almost ethereal, a young woman shaped by a hard life, yet carrying something else, something more delicate beneath the surface. Her mind was a labyrinth of thoughts, filled with the echoes of past decisions and the ghosts of choices made long ago. She had been born into this life of outlaws and shadows, raised in the constant uncertainty of a world where loyalty and survival often clashed with her own desires for something more. Lily glanced briefly at the group of outlaws, men who had become her family by necessity, not choice. She had learned to trust them, though there were times when even that trust seemed fragile. Her eyes softened for a moment, her heart heavy with something she couldn't quite name. She wasn't like them, not in the way they were. They lived for the thrill, the chase, the freedom that came with living outside the law. But Lily had always known there was more to life than this, something beyond the endless days of running and hiding, beyond the escape from one town to the next. She turned her back to the group, retreating a few steps into the darkened edges of the camp, her boots crunching softly in the dry earth. The isolation was familiar, the kind of solitude that had become her refuge in moments like this. Alone, she could breathe without the constant pressure of expectations, without the weight of her legacy. She closed her eyes, her breath steady but slow, as if trying to collect her thoughts. For a fleeting moment, the world outside the campfire's reach seemed distant, far away from the endless chase and the uncertainty of living life on the run. But then the reality of her situation settled back in, as it always did. She was still here, still in this life, and it was not something she could escape so easily. Her gaze moved to the edge of the camp once more, her reflection fleeting in the dance of the flames. There was a longing in her eyes, an unspoken desire for something she couldn't quite grasp, a life without fear, a life without running, a life where the woman she had been, before the outlaws, before the choices that had shaped her, could still exist. She could almost see it, as if it were a distant dream just out of reach. But Lily knew better than to chase dreams. This was the life she had, the only one she could hold on to now. The fire crackled again, bringing her thoughts back to the present. She stood tall, drawing in a deep breath before turning back toward the circle of outlaws. They were waiting for her, whether they realized it or not. She was a part of their world, just as much as they were a part of hers. Her eyes hardened, and the moment of doubt slipped away as she rejoined them, the fierceness in her gaze returning. The firelight shimmered in her hair as she took her place by the fire once more, her figure framed by the wild, untamed backdrop of the frontier. The flickering light of the flames reflected off the rough-hewn faces of the outlaws, the shadows playing on their features like a reminder of the danger they lived with every day. Lily Dalton was many things: outlaw, survivor, and sometimes, in the quiet moments, something more. Something that longed for a life beyond the one she had been given. But for now, she was a part of the camp, a part of the shadows, and that was all she could be. The fire burned brightly, casting its light into the dark night, and Lily Dalton stood at the center of it all, a woman caught between the fierce world she knew and the life she dared to dream. The fire crackled, its warm light flickering against the darkening sky as the group of outlaws settled around it, their faces glowing with a mixture of weariness and resolve. The desert night was cool, the air sharp with the scent of earth and sagebrush, but the fire provided a comfort they all needed, a moment of warmth in a world that often felt cold. Around the fire, the usual routine played out. Hands gripped mugs of coffee, thick and bitter, while others passed around the last of the bread and jerky. The murmurs of conversation filled the air, but there was an underlying tension that hung between the words, a quiet understanding that tonight, more than usual, the stakes felt higher. Lily sat across from Roland, her back straight, her green eyes focused on the flames, though her thoughts seemed far away. The others spoke, but she didn't fully hear them. Her mind was elsewhere, wandering to places she couldn't quite reach, to a life she once dreamt of but had long since set aside, a life of peace, of safety, of something more than this. "We're riding out at dawn," Roland's voice cut through the low hum of the camp. His tone was calm, calculating. "There's a ranch a few days' ride to the east. Big money there, easy pickings." Lily's gaze shifted, but her expression remained unreadable. She knew the routine, knew it all too well, the endless runs, the quick plans, the escape. It was their way of survival. But something in her stirred, something she couldn't ignore. "We're just supposed to take what we want?" A voice chimed in from the shadows. It was Jake, young and restless, his voice tinged with something close to doubt. "And then what? Another chase? Another fight?" Lily's gaze flickered briefly to Jake, then back to the fire. She didn't speak, but she knew what he was feeling. It wasn't the first time someone had voiced that question, and it wouldn't be the last. The thrill of the outlaw life was wearing thin on more than one of them. She could see it in their faces, hear it in the pauses between their words. "Jake's right," another voice interjected, this one from the older man sitting beside Roland. He was a grizzled, thin fellow who had seen too many years of hard living to be fooled by promises of gold or glory. "The price of this life ain't cheap. We run, we fight, and sometimes we don't make it out at all." Lily's heart twisted at the words. She understood the price, the toll it took. She'd lived with it, breathed it, accepted it as part of the deal. But there were moments, fleeting ones, when she wondered if there was something else, something beyond this world of shadows and dust. "What do you suggest?" Roland asked, his voice low and challenging, his eyes narrowing as he looked around the camp. "That we settle down? Let ourselves get caught like cattle, waiting for the next raid? That's not who we are." "Maybe it should be," Lily spoke suddenly, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. The moment they left her mouth, she regretted it. The fire popped, the sound harsh in the sudden quiet that followed. All eyes turned to her, a mixture of surprise and confusion hanging in the air. Lily stood, suddenly aware of the weight of the moment, her breath caught in her throat as she stood, eyes shifting from face to face. Roland's gaze was hard, but there was a flicker of something else behind it, something he didn't show often. "What did you say?" Roland asked, his voice steady but thick with something unspoken. "I said maybe it should be," Lily repeated, her voice quieter this time. "Maybe we've been running for too long. Maybe we've forgotten what it means to live instead of just survive." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a long moment no one spoke. It wasn't like her to question the life they led. No, it wasn't just the life they led. It was the only life she knew, the one she had been born into, the one that had shaped every choice she had made since she was a child. But Roland's eyes were sharp and his jaw tightened as if to push her words aside. "You're forgetting yourself, Lily. The world doesn't let us rest. We take what we can and we keep moving." "But at what cost?" Lily's voice wavered for just a moment before she steadied herself. "At what cost do we keep running?" Roland stood then, his towering presence filling the space between them. "The cost is survival. You want more? You want peace? Go ahead, walk away, see how far it gets you." Her heart clenched at the words, but she didn't back down. Her chest tightened, and she felt the raw emotion of her longing pulling at her. She had spent so many years hiding from that feeling, ignoring it, burying it beneath the need to survive. But now it was out there, naked and exposed. "I'm not walking away," she said, her voice steady. "But that doesn't mean I have to like it." The fire crackled again, the heat pressing against her skin, and Lily's gaze dropped, her eyes focusing on the flames. She felt the weight of every decision she had made in that single moment, the life she had known, the loyalty that bound her to them. Roland, the only family she had left, had raised her in the shadows, taught her how to survive, how to fight, how to never show weakness. He had been everything to her, and yet somewhere along the way she had started to wonder if there was something more. Lily's fingers tightened into fists at her sides, her gaze drifting to the dancing flames, the fire reflected in her eyes, making them burn with a fierce intensity. She was caught between two worlds, between the fierce loyalty she felt for the family that had taken her in and the quiet pull of a life she had never been able to reach. The crackling fire filled the silence between them, the tension stretching thin before it slowly eased into a quiet that seemed to settle over the camp. Lily stared into the flames, torn between the loyalty to her family, the ones who had given her this life, and the deep, aching desire for something else, something better, something that might never be. She wasn't sure what she wanted anymore, but one thing was certain. This world, with its endless chase, had begun to feel too small, and no matter how much she loved them, the fire of her own dreams would not be easily quenched. As the firelight flickered, Lily Dalton sat still, the weight of her decision heavier than ever. The wind stirred the air, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust, and in that moment, Lily realized that the battle for her heart had only just begun. Chapter 2. A Chance Encounter. The late afternoon sun cast a muted golden light through the grimy windows of the saloon, but the warmth of the day was quickly swallowed up by the thick haze of cigar smoke and the musky scent of sweat, leather, and spilled whiskey. The dim glow of flickering gaslight barely cut through the gloom, but it was enough to reveal the rough-hewn, weathered tables and worn chairs scattered throughout the room. The saloon was alive with the buzz of conversation, the sharp clink of glass against wood, and the rhythmic clatter of dice against the table. The piano at the far corner played a lively tune, its notes dancing in the air, adding a bit of cheer to the otherwise gritty ambience. A man in a ragged coat played the keys with an almost desperate energy, his fingers moving rapidly as if trying to outrun the weight of his past. His audience was a scattering of weary souls, locals and travelers alike, leaning against the bar, gossiping in low tones, or laughing too loudly at jokes only half heard. At one of the far tables, a group of cowboys played cards, their laughter cutting through the low hum of the room. One of them, a young man with a thick neck and broad shoulders, slapped his cards down triumphantly, his laugh bellowing as he tossed a coin into the center of the table. His companions grumbled, then joined in, all of them leaning back in their chairs with the kind of ease that only comes with a life lived in the open air and the wild unpredictability of the frontier. A few feet away, a couple of women leaned against the bar, their brightly colored skirts barely brushing the floor as they flirted with a pair of miners who were too drunk to care about anything other than the clink of their own coins. The conversation was loud enough to attract the attention of anyone who cared to listen, though the miners didn't seem to notice. They had already checked out of the world and into their own haze of alcohol and daydreams. The saloon hummed with the undercurrent of tension, the kind that always lingered in a place where men came to drown their disappointments and women came to pick up the pieces. The thick fog of smoke seemed to curl into every corner, wrapping around the room and making it feel smaller, more intimate, despite the rough-and-tumble crowd. This was a place where stories were shared, deals were made, and lives were decided in hushed voices. The heavy door creaked on its hinges, and all eyes in the saloon seemed to shift toward it. Elias Macready stepped into the dim light, his tall frame filling the doorway as he surveyed the room with a calm, practiced gaze. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor was muffled by the noise, but there was a distinct authority in the way he moved, steadfast, unwavering, like a man who had seen both the best and worst of life and knew that nothing could surprise him anymore. His blue eyes scanned the room quickly, taking in the faces, the movements, the quiet whispers exchanged between the patrons. A sheriff's job was never easy, but here, in the heart of the frontier, it was a job that required more than just law. It required understanding the pulse of a place, its secrets, its fears, its desires. And for a moment Elias allowed himself to linger on those little details, the kind of things that didn't matter to most people, but that meant everything to someone like him. The nervous glance of a man at the bar, the overly loud laugh that masked discomfort, the way a woman adjusted her shawl when someone walked by. And then his gaze shifted, and he froze. At a table near the far corner, sitting alone but not quite alone, was a woman. She sat with the kind of quiet strength that immediately captured his attention. Her auburn hair, bright even in the low light, cascaded over her shoulders in waves, and the faint gleam of the firelight made it seem like it was alive with the same spirit he'd seen in the land around him. Her eyes, green as the rolling hills of the valley he'd passed through earlier, were focused on the glass in front of her, her fingers idly tracing the rim as if lost in thought. There was an air about her, something he couldn't place. Something between defiance and vulnerability, a tension that seemed to vibrate in the space between them. She didn't belong to the laughter, the noise, the rowdy men that filled the room. No, she was something different. Something both more and less than the world around her. For a moment, time seemed to slow as Elias watched her, the music and noise fading away until there was nothing but the woman at the table, her face lit by the flickering light from the fire, her gaze soft yet distant. He could see the faint lines of weariness around her eyes, the quiet resignation in her posture, but also something else, a strength that didn't fit with the world she inhabited. His breath hitched, just for a second, and in that moment their gazes met. The connection was instant, electric. La! La! Her eyes locked onto his, and for a heartbeat the whole room disappeared. Her expression softened, her lips parting just slightly as if she had caught him in a fleeting moment of vulnerability, and she could feel the weight of that understanding between them. Elias held her gaze, his mind whirling. He had never seen her before, yet there was something in that moment, something in the curve of her mouth and the light in her eyes that made him feel as though he had known her his entire life. He could feel the pull of her, the invisible thread that seemed to draw him closer despite the distance between them. But then, as quickly as the moment had begun, it was gone. The clink of a glass, the shuffle of a card game, the murmur of voices brought them both back to the present, and Elias's gaze shifted, his lips pressed into a thin line as he turned away. He knew better than to linger on such moments. The law had no time for distractions. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just passed between them. Something neither of them could quite name yet, but something that would follow them both long after the chance encounter. And Lily? She watched him too, her heart pounding in her chest as though the room had closed in around her. She could feel the weight of his presence, the authority in his stride, and the unspoken question that hung between them. But she too was quick to look away, her gaze falling to the table once more, her mind racing with thoughts she had no words for. In the saloon's shadows, two strangers had met. Neither could have known then, but that glance would be the first thread in a complicated tapestry that would bind their fates together. The town of Dunwood had settled into its usual rhythm by twilight, the dimming light casting long shadows along the dirt roads as people wrapped up their day, retreating into the warmth of their homes or the dim interior of the saloon. A soft wind stirred the dust, and the air smelled of dry earth and the faintest hint of pine carried on the breeze from the distant hills. It was in this quiet hour, when the world seemed to hold its breath between the fading light of day and the cool embrace of night, that Elias Macready made his way to the outskirts of town. His boots crunched lightly on the narrow dirt path, the sound swallowed up by the expansive silence of the land. His mind was clouded, the events of the past few days settling heavily on his shoulders. There was a deep tension gnawing at him, a feeling that something had shifted in the town, in him, and he wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. Lily had sent word to meet, a note tucked beneath the corner of his office door. It had been brief, cryptic, and yet unmistakable in its urgency. She had told him to come alone, that there were things they needed to discuss, things that couldn't be said within the prying ears of Dunwood's gossiping citizens. As Elias walked toward the grove, the familiar sight of the town fading behind him, the air around him seemed to grow still, as if nature itself were holding its breath. A narrow trail snaked through the trees, winding toward a secluded grove, where the last of the daylight filtered through the thick canopy of branches, casting dappled shadows across the ground. It was a place untouched by the bustle of the town, hidden from view by the thick underbrush and the towering oaks that lined the path. The grove was quiet save for the gentle rustling of leaves as the evening breeze stirred them. Elias slowed his pace as he reached the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the edge of their world, the point where their lives, so carefully kept apart, might finally converge. The shadows lengthened, drawing closer, as though the earth itself were conspiring to protect them from the scrutiny of the outside world. Lily was already there, standing at the edge of the grove, her back to him. She looked like a silhouette against the fading light, her figure outlined in soft gold, her auburn hair glowing faintly in the last traces of daylight. For a moment Elias stood still, watching her. There was something about her, something in the way she carried herself that made his heart catch in his throat. When she turned, her green eyes met his, the same intensity from their earlier encounter in the saloon flickering in her gaze. She didn't speak at first, but the briefest of smiles tugged at her lips, soft, fleeting, but enough to unsettle him. It was as if this moment, this stolen time between them, had opened a door neither of them knew how to close. "Sheriff?" she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper against the quiet hum of the grove. He didn't respond at first, only nodded. There was a subtle tension between them, one that neither of them had expected. She was the daughter of outlaws, a woman whose life was entwined with the very chaos he had sworn to bring to heel. But there, in the quiet shadows of the grove, they were just two people, two souls, both struggling to make sense of the world they inhabited. Lily took a step closer, her boots barely making a sound on the earth beneath them. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, her eyes scanning his face, searching for something she... Elias's breath caught for just a moment, and he glanced away, toward the horizon where the last light of the sun dipped below the tree line. "Why did you ask me to come?" Her gaze softened, and she hesitated before speaking. "I needed to talk, to explain. There are things you don't know, things about me, about why I can't leave it behind." The words hung in the air, and for a moment the silence between them seemed to stretch. Elias' heart pounded in his chest, the weight of her words sinking in like stones. He could feel the pull of her presence in the quiet space between them. It was impossible not to feel it, the connection that seemed to tie them together despite everything that separated them. "I don't need an explanation, Lily," he said softly, his voice rough as if it had been too long since he had said anything that truly mattered. "I don't expect you to walk away from your family, from everything you know. I understand the loyalty you feel, but I also know the cost of that loyalty. You've seen what it does to people. You've seen what it's done to you." She looked away, her expression tightening, her shoulders tensing. The vulnerability she had shown earlier, the softness in her eyes, now seemed distant, hidden behind the walls she had built to protect herself. She bit her lip, clearly wrestling with the emotions she was trying to keep in check. "You think I don't know what it costs?" Her voice was low, but there was a bite to it now. "You think I haven't paid the price for this life? Every damn day of it. I've buried pieces of myself along the way, but I can't escape it. It's who I am." Elias stepped closer, his heart heavy with the truth of her words. "You don't have to be that, Lily. You don't have to carry that weight forever." Her eyes met his again, and in them he saw the conflict she couldn't hide, the desire for something more, something better, and the harsh reality of the life she had been born into. The setting sun bathed her in a soft glow, her features illuminated in the last light of the day, and Elias couldn't help but reach out, his hand hovering just inches from hers. "I don't know what you want from me, Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling just slightly, her body tense like a rope pulled too tight. "You don't understand. I can't leave this behind, not yet, not without—" Her words trailed off, the unspoken truth between them heavy in the space that separated them. And in that moment, as the evening breeze stirred the leaves above them, Elias realized something. They were both trapped. Trapped by duty, by loyalty, by the choices they had made. But there, in the quiet shadows of the grove, they had found a fleeting moment of understanding, one that would only last as long as the setting sun. The sky above them darkened, the stars beginning to emerge in the distance, and Elias finally let his hand drop. "Maybe we both need time to figure out what we really want," he said softly, his voice raw with a longing he didn't fully understand. She nodded, a small wistful smile crossing her lips. "Maybe." And for a long moment neither of them spoke. The air around them was cool now, the light fading, leaving them in the embrace of the night. A new tension lingered between them, one that neither could deny, but that neither knew how to navigate. It was a tension that would grow with every stolen moment they shared, every secret word spoken in the shadows. But for now the grove was still, the sound of the wind through the trees the only answer to the questions neither of them had voiced aloud. The clearing at the edge of the grove felt untouched by the world, a haven of solitude where the world beyond the trees seemed far away. The light had all but faded now, leaving only the soft glow of the moon to outline the delicate shape of the landscape. A faint breeze whispered through the leaves, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. The air was cool, refreshing, and there was a palpable stillness, as if the earth itself had chosen to listen to the conversation unfolding within its shelter. Elias McCready stood just outside the small circle of firelight that Lily had started in the center of the clearing, his gaze distant, his posture slightly tense, as though he were unsure whether to move closer or keep his distance. The fire crackled and popped, casting fleeting shadows across his face, sharpening the sharp lines of his jaw and the hollows beneath his cheekbones. His eyes, usually so calm and measured, were restless now, shifting from one spot to the next, as if he could not settle on what to say. The usual guardedness that kept him in control had begun to slip, and in its place was something raw, something more human. "I never asked for this," Elias said, his voice rougher than usual as he finally spoke. His tone was quiet, edged with weariness. He stared at the fire, his large frame leaned slightly forward, his elbows braced on his knees, like the weight of the world was pressing him closer to the ground. "I didn't ask for the badge or the responsibility, but here I am, tasked with keeping a law in a land that has none. A man is supposed to uphold the law, but who does he turn to when the law itself feels like a joke?" Lily's gaze softened, and for the first time she saw the weight of the man behind the badge, the burden of authority that had aged him, even if only in spirit. His words echoed a kind of loneliness she had not expected. There was a quiet sadness beneath his tough exterior, a quiet yearning for something more than the role he had been given. She leaned back against a nearby tree, her arms crossed loosely, her heart beginning to thrum a little faster at the rawness in his words. "I don't know what it's like to bear that kind of responsibility," she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with a rare vulnerability. "But I know what it's like to be torn between two worlds, between loyalty and freedom. Every day I wake up and wonder if this is the life I'm supposed to live, or if there's something else for me, something beyond this life of hiding and running." She paused, her fingers lightly brushing the rough bark of the tree she rested against, as though the very act of touching it could ground her, could steady her. "The people I've lived with, the ones I call family, they are my blood, my history. But they are also the chains that bind me to this life. I've spent so many years following the outlaw code, believing in it, that it's hard to imagine a life without it. But I can't help wondering, if I were to leave it behind, if I could find something else, something that doesn't require me to be in constant flight, never knowing what's waiting around the corner." Her voice dropped and she looked down at the ground, unable to meet his gaze for a moment. The fire crackled again, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. There was an understanding that had taken root, and though neither of them spoke, the air seemed to hum with it. Elias exhaled slowly, his hand resting on his thigh as he turned his head slightly to glance at her. "I didn't choose this life either," he murmured, his eyes tracing the flickering shadows of the fire. "It chose me. I don't know that I ever wanted to be a lawman, but now that I am, there are days when I wonder if I'll ever find peace with it. I spend my time chasing criminals, breaking out fights and putting out fires in a town that never stops needing something, and when the day's over, I sit alone in my office, staring at that damn badge, and wonder why it feels so heavy." Lily's breath hitched in her throat as she listened, a sharp ache forming deep in her chest. She could see it now, the quiet torment behind his steady demeanor, the yearning for something that could never be satisfied, for something more than the weight of the badge he wore. She knew that feeling all too well. The constant tension between duty and desire, between survival and something deeper. The fire between them seemed to crackle with the energy of their shared vulnerabilities, drawing them closer, not physically, but emotionally. The moment hung between them, delicate and fragile, as if they both feared speaking too much, revealing too much. Lily swallowed, the words on the tip of her tongue, hesitant but longing to be spoken. "I understand what you mean. The way you get pulled into something you never asked for. I've felt that every day of my life, but the difference is that I've never known anything else. There's no way out. There's no else. I've done things I'm not proud of, things that keep me awake at night, but I still keep going, because to stop would mean to face what I've lost, and what I'm afraid I'll never find." Elias's brow furrowed slightly, a line of concern etched across his forehead. The firelight flickered against his features, making them appear more human, more vulnerable. "You don't have to live like that, you know," he said, his voice softer now, the weight of the conversation shifting. "You don't have to keep running. There's more for you than this life, more than just surviving." Lily's heart pounded against her ribs, her chest tightening as his words brushed against the deepest parts of her. She looked into his eyes, and for the briefest moment she saw the same longing that had been gnawing at her for so long mirrored in him, the desire for something more, for a life beyond the rules they had been forced to live by. "You're right," she whispered, almost to herself. "But what if the more doesn't exist for me? What if all I have is this life?" Elias was quiet for a moment, as though considering her words. Then, slowly, he stepped a little closer to her, his gaze softening. "Then we make it," he said, his voice steady, the weight of his conviction filling the space between them. "We make something else, something better." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in their brief shared history, something in Lily shifted. A small spark of hope, fragile but undeniable, kindled inside her, pushed forward by the sincerity in his voice, by the quiet understanding that existed between them. It was a quiet moment, the air thick with the potential of what could come next. But for now, it was enough to stand there, together, and share in the vulnerability they had both tried so hard to hide. A shared moment of clarity that held the promise of something different, something neither of them had dared to dream of before. And as the night deepened, their conversation continued, soft and intimate, two souls slowly unraveling the ties that had bound them to their separate worlds. As the moonlight bathed the grove in its pale glow, Elias and Lily exchanged a quiet, lingering look before turning to leave. Their conversation had opened something inside both of them, something that neither of them knew how to close. It was a delicate thing, this newfound understanding between them, and both felt the weight of it as they silently retreated down the path, knowing the moment had passed, but that it had altered something between them. Something neither could ignore. Lily's steps were soft on the earth, her silhouette merging with the shadows as she disappeared into the night. Elias watched her go, his heart heavy with a burden he wasn't sure how to carry. Their worlds were as distant as the stars above them, and yet something pulled at him, something deeper than the rules, the law, and the responsibility that he had built his life upon. As he made his way back into town, the hushed murmur of the wind seemed to carry whispers of its own, drifting toward the town like a secret waiting to be told. By the time Elias entered the dimly lit streets of Dunwood, the town had begun to settle into its usual rhythm for the evening. The saloon was alive with the sounds of laughter and the sharp clink of glasses, but there was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to be growing, something that had spread like wildfire in the hours since he had left. As he passed the row of weathered buildings, Elias could feel the eyes on him, townsfolk watching from doorways, their voices lowering as he passed. A few steps ahead, two men leaned against the rough-hewn post of the livery, their voices hushed, but the words still floated on the breeze. "Did you hear about the sheriff?" one man murmured, his voice low, barely more than a whisper. "He's been meeting with her, the outlaw's daughter." The second man spat into the dirt, his face a mask of disbelief. "Ain't no lawman's business associating with her kind. What's he up to? What's he thinking?" The first man shifted, casting a quick look around before leaning in closer. "I don't trust it. Something about him's been different. You seen how secretive he's been lately? This ain't just about the law anymore, not with her involved." Elias could hear the conversation, though he didn't let his gaze waver or falter. He kept his pace steady, but the words stung like a lash against his skin. There were always whispers. In a town like Dunwood, gossip was as much a part of the air as the dust. But this felt different. His association with Lily, the daughter of an outlaw, had already begun to cast shadows on his reputation, and he could feel it tightening around him like a noose. As he reached the sheriff's office, Elias hesitated for a moment, the weight of the town's murmurs pressing in on him. This was the beginning of something that couldn't be undone. He had seen it before. The slow unraveling of trust, the questioning of authority. He had no illusions about the challenges ahead, but the choice had been made, and he could not walk away from it now. Meanwhile, just outside of town, the outlaw camp was alive with a different kind of tension. Lily's family had gathered around the fire, their faces darkened by the shadows of the trees, their voices low and urgent. The flames flickered, casting jagged shadows against the rough-hewn faces of the men and women who had spent their lives living on the fringes of society. Roland, the head of the outlaw group, stood in the center, his jaw clenched, his eyes scanning the faces of his kin. His long, calloused fingers tightened around the worn handle of his rifle as he addressed the group. "This can't go on," he growled, his voice sharp with the kind of anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for too long. "Lally's been meeting with the sheriff, right under our noses. We've all seen the way she looks at him. Don't think we don't know." A murmur passed through the group, a ripple of unease spreading across the faces of the men and women who had always lived with one foot in the shadows. They had trusted Lily, had seen her as one of their own, but now there was a crack in that trust. Roland's gaze flicked from face to face, noting the flicker of doubt in some of them. "You think I'm blind?" Roland continued, his voice a low hiss. "This ain't just a friendship. This is something more, and I don't know if she's on our side anymore. If she's going to turn on us, on me, then we deal with it. No more hesitation, no more wondering." Lily's stomach tightened, her heart a knot of guilt and frustration. She had been silent throughout the conversation, her eyes downcast as she watched the flames, her fingers absently twisting a strand of hair. Her mind raced. Roland's words were harsh, but they weren't wrong. Her actions had already begun to stir the pot, to put them all in a precarious position. She had trusted Ilias, but what had she really expected? The silence hung between them, and then, as if in answer to Roland's demand, one of the men, a broad-shouldered figure named Barlow, stood up. His face was shadowed, but his voice was clear and firm. "You're right, Roland. But don't you think we're risking too much here? We're not just outlaws anymore, we're rebels. If this goes further, if we push too hard, we'll have more than the law after us. We'll have every decent soul in this town hunting us down." Roland's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the firelight reflected something cold in his gaze. "You think I don't know that?" he snapped. "But we're already outlaws. We've always been rebels. We've already crossed that line, and I'll be damned if I let anyone, especially her, make me second-guess everything I've fought for." The group fell into a tense silence, the weight of Roland's words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Lily closed her eyes, the pull between loyalty to her family and her growing connection to Elias twisting in her chest. She had always known that something had to give, that she couldn't live in both worlds forever. But now, the pressure was mounting on all sides, and there was no escaping it. The scene split in the quiet aftermath of those words. Two worlds on the verge of collision, each standing on the edge of a precipice. In the town of Dunwood, Elias stood at the threshold of the sheriff's office, the darkening sky above him a reflection of the storm brewing in the town. A worried deputy leaned against the weathered post of the livery, his eyes narrowed, watching Elias closely. The deputy's posture was relaxed, but there was an edge to his stance, an uncertainty that matched the whispers in the air. It was only a matter of time before everything would come to light, and the sheriff, caught in the web of suspicion, would have to confront the consequences. Farther from town, in the outlaw camp, Roland paced near the fire, his silhouette dark against the glow, his boots crunching on the dry earth with each restless step. His anger simmered beneath the surface, but there was something more, a fear of what would happen if Lily's loyalties truly shifted, if she turned her back on the only family she had ever known. The collision was coming, one that would tear through both worlds and leave nothing untouched. And neither Elias nor Lily knew if they were ready for what it would mean. The sun was just beginning to rise over Dunwood, casting long shadows across the main street as the town slowly came to life. A few early risers moved about with purpose, pulling wagons loaded with goods, while the first smoke tendrils curled from chimneys, signaling the start of another busy day. But the usual hum of activity was tainted by an undercurrent of tension, an almost palpable anticipation in the air, like the moments before a storm. At the corner of the square, a small group of townsfolk had gathered outside the sheriff's office. They weren't talking, not at first, but their eyes were watchful, their faces drawn tight with worry and curiosity. Whispers spread like wildfire between them, silent exchanges, furtive glances, a quick shake of the head. The sheriff hadn't been seen in public much lately, and there were rumors, always rumors, swirling about his latest dealings. A few men leaned against the dusty boards of the saloon, their voices low, but the words were sharp. "You hear? McCready's been meeting with her, the outlaw girl." The speaker leaned closer to his companion, his voice a hiss. "And no one's seen him act so strange before. Don't think the lawman's doing what he should." "I heard he's been turning a blind eye to her kind," came the gruff reply. "You can't trust a man who lets an outlaw's daughter slip through his fingers." The murmurs grew louder as the crowd outside the sheriff's office began to swell. Eyes shifted toward the building, a quiet sense of judgment already taking root in the minds of the town's residents. They had seen their sheriff hold the line before, had trusted him to keep the peace, but now there was doubt. And doubt, once planted, grew like weeds. Elias McCready strode out from the office, his boots heavy on the wooden steps as he descended toward the street. He was still dressed in his usual attire, his duster coat billowing slightly with each stride, his broad shoulders carrying the weight of responsibility with the ease of habit. His gaze was sharp, focused on the street ahead, but it didn't take long for him to feel the shift in the air, the sudden stillness, the way the townsfolk turned their heads just a little too quickly, their whispered conversations faltering into silence. His heart quickened, but he kept his expression steady, the mask of the lawman firmly in place. He wasn't a man prone to public displays of emotion, but today was different. The weight of the eyes on him, the weight of their unspoken judgment, felt heavier than usual. As he walked toward his horse, Elias's gaze flickered to the group gathered near the saloon. He caught the eye of Deputy Sam Curtis standing near the door with his arms folded, a concerned look etched on his face. "Morning, Sam," Elias said, his voice steady, though the tension was evident in the lines of his jaw. Sam gave a brief nod, but his eyes weren't on Elias. They were on the crowd that had begun to form, their faces filled with suspicion, and a few with barely veiled contempt. "Sheriff, there's talk. Word's been spreading about your association with her. People are talking, Elias. They don't like it." Elias's stomach tightened, but he couldn't afford to show any weakness. He didn't respond immediately, focusing instead on mounting his horse. The crowd continued to murmur, the uneasy feeling in the air thickening with every passing second. He had lived with suspicion before, but this felt different. More biting, more critical. Just as he was about to ride out, a sharp shout cut through the murmur of voices. "That's him, the sheriff." A man with a weathered face and an angry glint in his eye stepped forward, his arm raised to point directly at Elias. His voice, thick with accusation, rang out loud enough for the entire town to hear. "He's the one who's been protecting that outlaw's daughter. The law don't stand for that." Elias's head whipped toward the man, his heart sinking. The words hit like a slap, and before he could react, more voices joined in. First a few murmurs, then an angry chorus of accusations. "He's been giving her a free pass," someone shouted. "He's been seen with her, talking like they're allies," another added. "Shouldn't be no place for her in this town, not with the lawman in her pocket." The words came faster, louder, until they were a cacophony of blame, each voice ratcheting up the tension in the air. Elias's hand tightened on the reins, his pulse quickening. He had dealt with trouble before, but this was different. These weren't just whispers, these were open accusations, the beginning of something more dangerous. His gaze swept over the crowd, seeing not the faces of the townsfolk who had once trusted him, but instead their doubt, their disappointment, and, in some, the very real fear that he had betrayed them. Sam Curtis took a hesitant step forward, his hand resting on his own sidearm. "Elias," he said, his voice laced with caution, "maybe it's time we clear this up before it gets out of hand." But it was too late. The crowd had begun to grow bolder, their murmurs turning into outright criticism. The once steadfast respect they had held for their sheriff was crumbling before their eyes, the cracks appearing in the foundation of trust that Elias had spent so many years building. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, the fire of indignation rising inside him. He opened his mouth to speak, to set things right, but before he could, a loud, crackling voice from the back of the crowd cut him off. "He's been seen with her more than once, and we all know what that means." The man who spoke was older, with graying hair and a hardened face, someone who had been in Dunwood for longer than most, and whose opinion carried weight. Elias's face shifted, his expression turning from one of determination to one of dismay as the crowd's ire grew. It wasn't just that they didn't understand, it was that they were no longer willing to. Their trust in him was fading, eroding like stone under the weight of suspicion. "You think you're better than us, Elias?" someone else called out. "You think just because you wear that badge you're above us? You let a criminal's daughter slip right through your fingers, and now we're supposed to believe you still care about the law?" The words hit him like blows, and for a moment Elias stood there, caught between the rising tide of public outrage and the ache of betrayal in his chest. He had always known that his position would come with a price, but he had never imagined it would cost him so much so quickly. The townsfolk weren't just questioning his authority, they were questioning his very character. As the noise around him swelled, Elias closed his eyes for a brief moment, willing himself to calm. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. He had never felt more alone. He couldn't protect himself from the whispers, and he couldn't protect himself from the truth of what they were saying. Their words stung, but it was the reality of it. The fact that his connection with Lily, his decision to help her, had opened a chasm between him and the people he had sworn to protect, that truly hurt. The crowd's muttering continued, an undercurrent of anger, betrayal, and fear running through it all. Elias straightened, setting his jaw, determined not to let them see the cracks in his armor. But deep down, he knew the road ahead would not be easy, and the trust he had worked so hard to build had already begun to crumble. As the voices rose around him, Elias Macready, once the unwavering sheriff of Dunwood, stood at the center of a storm that he wasn't sure he could weather. The small back room of the sheriff's office was stifling, the only light filtering through a grimy window that barely allowed the dust-filled daylight to creep inside. The smell of wood and stale air clung to the walls, mingling with the sharp scent of the whiskey that Elias had poured earlier to steady his nerves. He hadn't expected this. A confrontation in the middle of the day with so many people who had once trusted him, now standing against him. The room was cramped with bodies, each one a weight on his already burdened conscience. Senior deputies, faces hard and unforgiving, filled the space along with town elders, their eyes filled with suspicion and disapproval. The air was thick with the tension of unspoken accusations, and Elias could feel it pressing in on him, suffocating him. He stood near the desk, his hands resting on the rough wood, gripping it tightly as he tried to steady the fluttering of his pulse. His face was calm as it always was, but beneath the surface his mind was racing. He had never imagined this kind of reckoning, not in all his years as sheriff. He had always been the man who upheld the law, who commanded respect. But now those same people were looking at him like a stranger. Worse, they were looking at him like a traitor. "Is it true, Elias?" A voice broke the silence, cutting through the air like a knife. It was Old Man Williams, one of the town's founding members, and a man whose opinion had carried weight for as long as anyone could remember. His eyes were narrow, a mixture of disbelief and betrayal clouding his wrinkled face. Elias lifted his chin slightly, trying to hold on to the dignity that had carried him through worse situations, though it was starting to slip away like sand through his fingers. "What are you asking, Williams?" His voice was calm, but the tightness in his chest betrayed him. "I've done my duty. You know that." Williams shook his head, his mouth twisted into something between a frown and a sneer. "Don't play coy with me, McCready. You've been seen with her, the outlaw's daughter. Are you telling me that's nothing? Are you telling me it's all just a coincidence? Your judgment is clouded, and it's time someone said it." The words hit Elias harder than he expected. He had braced himself for accusations, but the weight of the betrayal in Williams' voice struck him deeper than the accusations themselves. He had never been one to shy away from the hard truths, but hearing them from men like this, men who had once looked to him as a leader, cut deeper than any knife. "She's not just some outlaw's daughter," Elias replied, his voice growing strained. "She's a person. I'm doing what I can to stop the violence that's been happening in this town, and she's the key to it. You don't understand, Williams. None of you do." Deputy Sam Curtis, who had been silent until now, shifted uncomfortably by the door, his face torn between loyalty to his sheriff and the pressure of the town's increasing demands. His voice broke through the tension, quieter but no less firm. "Sheriff, with all due respect, we've got a town that's starting to lose confidence in you. If the people see you defending someone like her, someone who's tied to lawlessness, well, you know how they'll react." Elias's jaw clenched, his hand gripping the edge of the desk harder as the pressure mounted. He could feel the eyes of the men and women in the room drilling into him, waiting for him to break, waiting for him to admit that his loyalty had shifted, but he couldn't do that. Not yet. "You think I don't know that?" Elias snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. He glanced around the room, his gaze falling on each of the familiar faces, each one a symbol of the trust he had worked his whole life to build. "You think I don't feel the weight of this? You think I'm blind to the dangers of keeping her close? But I'm not making decisions based on sentiment. I'm making them based on the law. I'm doing what I think is right, and I'm not going to apologize for that." "Right," Williams scoffed, taking a step toward him. "What about the law, Elias? What about the town that's relied on you for justice? The law doesn't bend, not like this. You've gone soft, thinking you can play both sides. You've lost your way." The words felt like a slap in the face, and Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself, but a weight of exhaustion settled over him and he hesitated. He had spent his life building this reputation, this sense of duty, but now it was crumbling before his eyes. What could he say to defend something that felt like it was already lost? Deputy Curtis stepped forward, his eyes locked on Elias, trying to offer some silent support. "Sheriff, maybe it's time we took a step back," Sam said, his voice low and measured. "Maybe we should look at this from the outside without the personal attachments clouding things." Elias's heart twisted in his chest. It was a suggestion made out of concern, not malice, but it felt like a betrayal nonetheless. "So, what? You're all telling me to give her up? To turn my back on someone who's trying to help us?" "It's not about turning your back on her, Elias," Williams said, his tone becoming more forceful. "It's about doing what's best for the town, for the people who've trusted you to protect them. You've let your personal feelings cloud your judgment." The pressure inside Elias's chest tightened painfully. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in on him, and every word, every look from the others in the room was a reminder that he was alone in this. They didn't understand. They didn't see the complexity of the situation the way he did. They saw only the surface, only the threat of rebellion and lawlessness. His thoughts raced, his mind whirling with a mixture of frustration and self-doubt. Had he truly become what they were accusing him of? Had his personal feelings overridden his duty as sheriff? For a moment, Elias closed his eyes, letting the stillness of the room settle over him. the sound of his own breath loud in his ears. When he opened his eyes again, his gaze was steady, though the weariness was clear. He turned to face Williams and the others, his voice quieter but no less determined. "I won't apologize for doing what I believe is right," Elias said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "But I understand your concerns. I'll step down if you think I've become a liability to this town, if you think I've lost my way." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but he knew that sometimes doing the right thing meant making difficult choices. Williams's expression softened, but the judgment remained. "We'll have to talk, Elias. We'll have to decide what's best for the town and what's best for you." As the deputies and town elders filed out of the room, Elias felt the weight of their judgment pressing in on him. The office was suddenly too small, the air too thick. The sheriff stood there alone, the room spinning around him as he faced the reality of his situation. The road ahead was uncertain, and the burden of the law weighed heavier than ever. The door to the sheriff's office creaked on its hinges as Elias McCready entered, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The dim light from a single lantern flickered weakly on the wooden walls, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to grow with each passing minute. The room was sparse, functional, nothing more than a desk, a few worn chairs, and the heavy, ever-present weight of duty that Elias had carried for years. But tonight the room felt like a cage. Elias moved toward the desk, his boots making no sound against the floor, as if even the floorboards understood the gravity of the moment. He sank into the creaky chair behind the desk, the weight of the town's expectations pressing down on him like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the dust of disillusionment and frustration. The lantern light flickered, casting brief flashes of warmth on the dark wood, but Elias barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, spiraling through the events of the day, the confrontation, the accusations, the disappointed eyes of those who had once trusted him. The harsh words of the town elders echoed in his ears, sharp and unforgiving. "You've lost your way, Elias," they had said, and the words had stuck, sinking deep into him, gnawing at the edges of his pride. He rubbed his face, the stubble on his jaw scraping his palm as if to ground himself, to remind himself that he was still here, still standing, even if it felt like the world was slowly crumbling around him. His chest tightened as he thought of the crowd outside, the anger in their eyes, the whispers behind his back. How had it come to this? How had the man who had spent his life trying to uphold the law, to protect this town, become the villain in their eyes? A deep, troubled sigh escaped him as he reached for the photo on the desk, an old, worn picture of his family, his mother and father, their faces frozen in time, smiling as if the world was still full of possibility. Elias's heart clenched at the sight. He hadn't realized how much he had relied on that image for strength, how much it had reminded him of the purpose he had once felt. The badge on his chest had always been a symbol of that same purpose, the connection to a legacy of honor and duty, but now the photo seemed a cruel reminder of how far he had drifted from the man he had once aspired to be. What happened to that man, Elias wondered, his gaze fixed on the photo. He could almost hear his father's voice in his ear, stern yet loving, teaching him the weight of responsibility, the value of loyalty. But now that loyalty was being questioned, not just by the townsfolk, but by himself. He placed the photo back on the desk, his fingers lingering on the edge for a moment longer than necessary. The weight of the badge at his side felt heavier than it ever had before. Was it a symbol of honor, or a chain that kept him shackled to a life he no longer recognized? The thought sent a shiver through him. Every decision he had made, every choice he had thought was right, was now being turned against him. His connection to Lily, his desire to protect her, had become a point of contention, something that threatened to undo everything he had worked for. Elias stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed in the quiet room. He began pacing, his footsteps sharp, almost frantic, as if moving would somehow ease the storm raging inside him. The dark corners of the room seemed to press in on him, closing him off from the world he had tried so hard to protect. His mind churned with thoughts of the townspeople, what they thought of him now, what they said behind his back. How could he face them again? How could he stand before them, the man who had been the sheriff they trusted, now reduced to something else? The fear of losing his identity, of being reduced to nothing more than the man who had fallen from grace, was suffocating. He had spent so many years building his life on this identity, on being the one who upheld the law, the one people could turn to when all else failed, and now that life was slipping through his fingers. He came to a halt near the small window staring out into the night. The streets of Dunwood were empty now, the shadows stretching long across the town like dark fingers reaching out to take hold of everything he had known. It felt like he was already a ghost in his own life, drifting between the remnants of his past and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. What am I supposed to do now? The question echoed in his mind, unanswered, as the weight of his choices pressed down on him. He had never been prepared for this, never imagined that the law he had spent his life serving would turn against him, or that the connection to a woman like Lily, a woman tied to a world of criminals and chaos, would threaten to undo everything he had worked for. With a heavy sigh, Elias turned away from the window and walked back to his desk. His hand hovered over the badge on his chest, and for a moment he simply stared at it. The glint of metal seemed to mock him now, as if the very symbol of his life's work had become a reminder of his failures. He unpinned it slowly, the metal cold in his fingers, and placed it on the desk beside the family photo. The weight of it seemed to drain from his chest, but the emptiness left behind was even more unbearable. He stood there for a long moment, the silence thick around him. The only sound was his own breathing, ragged and uneven as he tried to push back the doubt that had taken root in his heart. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, or if he could ever be the man he had once been. The path ahead was uncertain, and the fear of losing everything, the life he had built, the trust he had worked so hard to earn, seemed more real than ever. As the fire in the hearth crackled faintly, Elias looked down at the badge, then at the family photo, and for the first time in a long while he allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. The uncertainty stretched out before him like an endless road, and Elias McReady, once so sure of his place in the world, was left standing at the crossroads, unsure of which direction to take. Chapter 3. Torn Allegiances. The dying light of the day lingered in the sky, casting the outlaw camp in a haze of amber and violet as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of pine and smoke from the campfire, the crackling flames dancing in the cool evening air. The camp, nestled in a small hollow between the jagged rocks, was surrounded by the sounds of nature. Whispers of the wind through the trees, the occasional rustle of the horses tethered nearby, and the low murmurs of the men and women gathered around the fire. As darkness settled in, the once peaceful camp became tense with unspoken conflict. The firelight flickered off the faces of the outlaws, illuminating their hardened expressions. They were a family bound not by blood but by the harsh code of survival, a code that had served them well in the unforgiving wilderness of the frontier. But tonight that code seemed to be unraveling, and the threads of loyalty that had once held them together were beginning to fray. Lily sat on a low log near the fire, her posture rigid as she stared into the flames. The flickering light painted her face in shifting shades of orange and gold, highlighting the sharp lines of her jaw and the soft curve of her lips. Her green eyes, usually fierce and determined, were clouded with a quiet frustration. She had never been one to shy away from a fight, but this was different. The tension in the air felt thick enough to cut through, and she could sense the weight of the conversation before it even began. "Lily?" Roland's voice broke the silence, rough and low, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "I've been watching you. You've been distant lately. Where's your head at? You're not with us anymore, are you?" Lily's heart clenched at the sharpness in his tone, but she kept her gaze fixed on the fire, unwilling to meet his eyes. She had known this moment was coming, the moment when the doubts she had tried to suppress would come crashing to the surface. Roland had always been the leader, the one who held the reins of the group, and his disappointment carried more weight than any of the others could understand. But her mind was already made up, and no amount of pressure could make her waver. "I'm here," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension. "I'm still with you. But I can't keep living in this endless cycle. I can't keep running, hiding, fighting without knowing why. I need to find something else, something more than just surviving." Roland's eyes darkened, and he took a step closer to her, the heat of the fire flickering between them. "Surviving is all we've ever known, Lily. You think we're going to just stop and walk away from everything we've built? You think you can just leave this life behind and be something else?" Lily stood up slowly, her shoulders squared, her expression hardening as she finally met his gaze. "I'm not asking to walk away from you," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "I'm asking for a chance to live a different life, a chance to do something that matters, something that doesn't have to end in bloodshed." The fire crackled loudly in the silence that followed, the tension between them palpable. The other members of the group shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. They had all heard the whispers of Lily's changing heart, the rumors of her growing doubts about the outlaw life, but they hadn't expected her to speak so openly about it. A man older than the rest, his face weathered by years of hard living and countless battles, stepped forward from the shadows. His name was Hector, a fierce figure in the camp, and his loyalty to the outlaw code was as unshakable as the land they roamed. His piercing gaze settled on Lily, his expression hardening as he spoke. "You're talking foolishness, girl," Hector spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can leave this life behind after everything we've done? After everything we've fought for? This isn't a game. You don't just walk away from us, from this family, without paying the price." Lily flinched at his words, but she didn't back down. "I'm not abandoning anyone," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm not abandoning you. I need something different, a life that doesn't involve death at every turn. I've seen too many people die. I've lost too much. I want more than this." Hector took a step forward, his face contorted with anger. "More," he repeated, his voice rising. "What do you think we are, then? You think we've built this life for nothing? You think you can just toss it all aside like it means nothing? Loyalty isn't just a word, Lily. It's what keeps us alive. You turn your back on this, you turn your back on us." The words hit her harder than she expected, and for a moment Lily felt a flicker of doubt rise inside her. She had always known the price of loyalty, the weight it carried, but hearing Hector's harsh words, feeling the anger radiating from him, made her question just how far she was willing to go. Could she truly walk away from everything she had known, from the people who had raised her, who had made her one of their own? But then she looked around the camp, at the faces of the outlaws who had become her family, and something inside her hardened. She couldn't stay in this world forever. She couldn't keep lying to herself, pretending that this was all she wanted. The fire in her heart, the yearning for something more, was stronger than any threat of retribution or loss. "I'm not turning my back on you," she said, her voice steady even as her heart ached. "But I can't stay in this life. I can't let it define me anymore. There has to be more than just survival, and I'm going to find it." The silence that followed was thick with unresolved tension. Hector's face was a mask of fury, but there was something else there too, something like hurt, as if her words had struck at a core he hadn't known was so vulnerable. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to die in his throat. Instead, he turned away, his boots crunching against the dirt as he walked toward the edge of the camp, leaving Lily standing there, alone in the firelight. Lily exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her heart racing as the weight of her words settled over her. She had never imagined it would be this hard, this painful, to confront the life she had known, to break away from the very thing that had kept her alive for so long. But as the fire crackled and the shadows stretched long around her, Lily Dalton knew she had made her choice. And no matter the cost, no matter the price, she was ready to face what came next. The tension in the camp hadn't dissipated, but there was no going back now. The clash between her loyalty to the only family she had ever known and her longing for something more had only just begun. The room was dim and quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath Elias's boots as he paced back and forth. The small sheriff's office, with its sparse furnishings and faint smell of ink and leather, felt more like a prison than the place where he had once taken pride in serving the law. The chair behind the desk, the one that had been his constant companion for years, was now a symbol of something he couldn't bear to sit in. The badge that once felt so right against his chest now seemed like a weight he could no longer bear. Elias stopped by the window, staring out at the twilight that draped the town of Dunwood in shadow. His face was a mask of tension, his jaw tight, his eyes clouded with regret. In the silence of the office, the weight of his recent decisions pressed down on him. He had once believed that protecting the law, upholding justice, was everything. But now, with the town's suspicions turning toward him, with whispers filling the streets, Elias wasn't so sure anymore. What had he done? His thoughts spiraled back to the moments of fleeting hope, to the days when he believed he could change things, make a real difference, the way he had stood tall in front of the town, sworn to uphold justice, to be the man they could trust. He had been so sure of himself, so confident. But now, with the growing pressure of the townspeople's anger and the moral tug of his connection with Lily, he felt as though the ground was shifting beneath him. A flash of memory surfaced, one of the rare moments of peace he'd had before the turmoil began. He saw himself younger, standing with his father in the same sheriff's office, his father's voice rich with pride as he fastened Elias's first badge. His father's steady hand had given him that badge, trusting him to be the man who would follow the law without hesitation, the man who would lead with courage and fairness. That was the man he wanted to be, the man he had always been, before doubt and regret had begun to cloud his every thought. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, the memory sharp and painful. He could almost feel the weight of his father's hand on his shoulder, the words of advice ringing in his ears. Son, do what's right. Even if it's the hardest thing you'll ever do, the people will respect you for it. They'll remember you for it. But those words seemed distant now, fading into the haze of doubt that surrounded him. His connection to Lily, the daughter of an outlaw, had complicated everything. She wasn't just an innocent caught in a web of crime. She was someone he had come to care for, someone whose very presence made him question the path he had so carefully walked. His duty to the law was supposed to be clear, but nothing about the situation with Lily was clear anymore. The door to the office creaked open, and Sam Curtis stepped inside. The young deputy's face was grim, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he had been wrestling with his own doubts too. "Sheriff?" Sam said quietly, standing by the door, his gaze flicking toward the desk where Elias still stood, his hands gripping the edge. "The town, they're talking. They're starting to question your judgment, your loyalty." Elias didn't respond immediately, his eyes tracing the grain of the wood on the desk. The words were as familiar as the weight of his own breath, but they still stung. He had known this was coming, but hearing it aloud made it real. He had allowed this to happen. His choices had led him to this point, and now he was being asked to defend not just his actions, but his very character. "I've done what I thought was right, Sam," Elias said, his voice low, tinged with frustration. "But it doesn't seem to matter anymore. They don't understand, and maybe I don't understand either." Sam didn't speak for a moment, but his gaze softened. "Maybe it's not just about understanding. Maybe it's about whether you can live with it, whether you can live with the consequences of the choices you've made." Elias let out a breath, his eyes closing for a moment. The silence between them was thick with the weight of truth. Could he live with it? Could he live with the consequences of helping Lily, of stepping outside the lines of the law he had sworn to uphold? "I don't know," he murmured, more to himself than to Sam. "I don't know if I can anymore." The next morning, the tension in Dunwood had only worsened. The sun, high in the sky, did little to dissipate the heaviness that hung over the town. People moved about their daily routines, but their eyes were cast low, their voices hushed. Whispers echoed in the narrow alleys and the corners of the shops and along the dirt streets that led to the sheriff's office. A small group had gathered outside the office, exchanging heated words in low tones, their expressions dark with suspicion. As Elias walked through the crowd, heads turned and murmurs followed him, but no one spoke directly to him. His presence was met with silence, the kind that cut deeper than any insult. Inside the saloon, the scene was no different. The low hum of conversation ceased when Elias entered. There was a sharp, uneasy tension in the air, and it only grew heavier when Deputy Pete Hall, one of the more influential men in town, leaned over to speak with a group of regulars, his voice carrying just loud enough for Elias to overhear. "Sheriff's been slipping lately," Pete said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "You can feel it, can't you? Something's off. He's got that girl in his corner. She's trouble, and he's let it get to him. If he's not careful, he'll lose this town. Hell, he'll lose everything." Elias could feel the weight of Pete's words like stones in his chest, his breath hitching for a moment before he forced himself to walk past, his jaw set tight. He couldn't let this destroy him. He couldn't let his choices, no matter how flawed they seemed now, lead him to failure. Meanwhile, at the outlaw camp, the same tension simmered. Roland paced around the fire, his boots kicking up dust as he muttered under his breath. Lily, sitting on a rock at the edge of the camp, could feel the growing unrest. The men were angry at her for what they perceived as a betrayal, angry at the uncertainty of the situation, and angry at the growing power Elias held over their lives. "We can't keep running forever, Roland," Lily said, her voice strained but firm. "You need to see that. We're not the only ones caught in this. Elias is too. He's trying to do right by both sides, and it's tearing him apart." Roland's eyes flashed with anger, his hand clenching around his rifle. "You think he's a man you can trust?" he snapped. "He's a lawman, Lily. He's the one who'll bring us down if we don't put a stop to this." Lily stood, her stance unwavering despite the simmering anger in Roland's voice. "No, he's not the enemy, Roland, not anymore." The fire crackled louder, as if reacting to the rising tension in the camp. Roland took a step forward, his face set in stone. "You're fooling yourself, Lily. You can't be with both of us. And soon you'll have to choose." Both sides, law and outlaw, were beginning to mobilize. The town's distrust of Elias had only fueled the fire, and in the shadows of the outlaw camp there were murmurs of a plan to leverage Lily's connection to Elias for their own gain. The tension between the two sides was reaching its peak, and the inevitable collision loomed closer with each passing moment. As Elias stood by the window, watching the sun begin its descent, he could feel the weight of the impending conflict. He was about to lose everything: the respect of the town, the life he had built, and possibly even Lily, who was caught between the two worlds. The stakes had never been higher, and in the distance, both sides were preparing for what was sure to be an inevitable clash. The morning sun was already climbing high in the sky as Elias Macready rode out of Dunwood, his silhouette framed against the vast, empty horizon. The rhythmic sound of hooves against hard-packed dirt echoed in the stillness, accompanied only by the wind's gentle whisper across the barren plains. The air was crisp, and the land, though beautiful in its raw simplicity, felt like a vast emptiness, untouched, unforgiving, and devoid of the familiar bustle of the town he had once called home. Elias's heart ached with a quiet, gnawing pain that matched the emptiness of the land around him. The weight of recent events pressed on him with every mile he rode. His fall from grace in the eyes of the townsfolk, the betrayal of those who had once trusted him, and the confusion that lingered over his decisions. But as the miles stretched between him and Dunwood, there was a certain clarity in the distance, a rawness in the solitude that allowed him to confront the turmoil swirling inside him. The land ahead was rugged, with jagged hills and wide-open plains that stretched out to meet the sky in a way that made Elias feel both insignificant and free. He could see the dusty road leading toward an isolated community, a small, struggling settlement that had no choice but to survive on the fringes of civilization. His thoughts turned inward as he rode, the weight of his badge on his chest serving as a constant reminder of the responsibility he had once taken pride in. But that pride had been shattered, and now Elias felt as though he was riding not just toward a physical destination, but toward something much deeper, a redemption that seemed as distant as the horizon itself. As the sun climbed higher, the land grew more barren, and Elias found himself passing through a stretch of desert that seemed to go on forever. The heat shimmered off the ground, and the air was dry and still, the silence only broken by the sound of his horse's hooves. He had left behind the familiar faces, the whispers of the town, and the burden of the expectations that weighed on him. Now it was just him and the vast, unforgiving landscape. Hours later, Elias arrived at a small, isolated settlement, a cluster of ramshackle buildings that had been built with little more than the sweat and grit of those who had no other choice but to settle here. The buildings were crooked, the streets dusty, and the air heavy with the scent of cattle and burnt wood. There were no bustling markets or friendly greetings, only the sharp eyes of the settlers who looked at Elias with the wariness of people who had long since learned not to trust anyone. He dismounted his horse and made his way toward the small saloon at the center of town. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the chatter inside fell silent. Elias's eyes scanned the room quickly, noting the rough men and women who occupied it, their faces lined with years of hardship. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a thick beard, raised an eyebrow at Elias as he approached the counter. "What'll it be?" the bartender asked, his voice gravelly from years of cigarette smoke and liquor. "I'm just passing through," Elias said, his voice steady but cold. "I need to talk to the sheriff." The bartender snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Sheriff? Ain't much of one here. Man's just a figurehead. Runs a protection racket, keeps the peace by turning a blind eye to the law. You won't find much help from him." Elias felt a flicker of frustration, but he forced it down. He had expected as much. In places like this, where the law was a mere suggestion, redemption was a far-off dream, but it was still something worth fighting for. Without another word, Elias left the saloon and made his way to the small shack where the so-called sheriff of the settlement resided. The building was old and worn, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Inside, the sheriff, a balding man with a scruffy beard and a bloodshot gaze, looked up as Elias entered. "Sheriff Macready," Elias said, his voice cool but firm. "I'm here to ask a few questions." The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he sized Elias up. "You're a long way from Dunwood, aren't you?" he drawled, his voice low and mocking. "What's a lawman like you doing here?" "I'm looking for a man named Brock Walters," Elias said, ignoring the sheriff's tone. "He's been causing trouble in the area. I need information." The sheriff chuckled, the sound harsh and humorless. "You won't find much here. People like Walters don't care much for the law. They come and go as they please, taking what they want. You should know that, Macready. You've been in this business long enough." Elias didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he felt the old bitterness rising inside him. This was the kind of world he was dealing with now, the kind of world where law meant nothing and those who clung to it were mocked, discarded, forgotten. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "I'm here to restore order," Elias said, his voice steady with determination. "No matter how far I have to go, no matter who I have to confront, I won't stop until I've done what I came here to do." The sheriff gave a half-hearted shrug, clearly uninterested in Elias's words. But Elias wasn't here to convince him. He was here to remind himself that he was still capable of doing what was right, still capable of being the lawman he had once aspired to be. Later, as Elias left the sheriff's shack and walked toward his horse, he paused on a high ridge overlooking the wide expanse of desert below. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scents of dust and sagebrush, and Elias took a deep breath, feeling the rawness of the land fill his lungs. The vast open plains stretched before him, a reminder of the freedom he had once sought, but also the isolation that came with it. He climbed onto his horse and rode toward the overlook, stopping at a small ridge that offered a view of the endless desert. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the land in shades of orange and gold. Elias gazed out over the plains, the vast emptiness before him echoing the turmoil inside his chest. He had come this far, but the road ahead was still unclear. His path to redemption would not be easy, and it would not be without sacrifice. But he couldn't turn back now. The choice had been made, and he had to see it through, for himself, for the people of Dunwood, and for the life he had once sworn to protect. As the sun dipped lower, Elias closed his eyes, feeling the cool night air begin to settle around him. He let out a slow, steady breath, making a vow to himself to restore his reputation through honorable deeds, no matter the cost. It was the only path forward now. The stars began to emerge in the sky above, a blanket of light in the darkening night. And Elias Macready, once certain of his place in the world, now rode on into the uncertain future, searching for redemption. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and the scent of burnt wood, the remnants of the evening's fire still crackling in the cool night. Lily stood on the fringes of the outlaw camp, the shadows of the campfire stretching long across the dry earth. The soft murmur of the group around the fire was the only sound, save for the occasional crack of a branch or the rustle of wind through the sparse trees that lined the camp's edge. She had never felt so exposed, so out of place among her own people. The world she had grown up in, the world she had once accepted without question, felt smaller now, suffocating. Tonight, she could no longer remain silent. She could no longer follow blindly, bound to a legacy of blood and violence that had always promised nothing but more of the same. Her heart raced with the knowledge that what she was about to do would mark her for the rest of her life. Her actions tonight would sever ties with the only family she had ever known, a family built on the unyielding tenets of survival at any cost. But in this moment, with the weight of the firelight warming her skin and the call of something more alive in her chest than ever before, Lily knew she could no longer be bound by that code. Roland was in the middle of a conversation with a few of the older members of the camp, his deep voice carrying over the fire as he discussed their next move, a raid on a nearby town that had been showing signs of resistance to their presence. The usual excitement rippled through the men as they gathered, planning their next strike with the fervor of those who believed in their cause. But Lily could no longer find excitement in that kind of life. Not after everything she had witnessed, not after everything she had lost. Tonight she would do something to help a town, one that had suffered at the hands of her family. It was time to make a choice that could never be undone. She turned, her gaze catching the eyes of a younger man standing at the edge of the camp, his face shadowed in the firelight. His name was Jeb, and though he was still new to the group, he had shown an unusual amount of loyalty toward her. He was hesitant, unsure, but in his eyes Lily saw something she hadn't seen in the others, a flicker of doubt, a quiet understanding that there was more to the world than just surviving. Lily walked over to him, her boots crunching softly against the earth as she approached. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and curiosity. She placed a hand on his arm, her fingers curling around his sleeve. "I need you to help me," she said, her voice low but firm. "It's time to stop this madness. I can't stand by and watch another town burn for no reason." Jeb's brow furrowed, his lips pressing together as if wrestling with the weight of her words. He had seen enough bloodshed to know what the stakes were, but he had never questioned the code before. Lily knew that this moment was a turning point for him, and perhaps for her, too. "You sure about this, Lily?" he asked, his voice quiet, his words tinged with hesitation. "You know Roland won't take kindly to it. You'll be risking more than just your life." Lily's eyes were steady, her determination clear. "I've already lost too much. I won't lose myself in this. Help me, Jeb." Help me stop this before it gets any worse." With a slow nod, Jeb's hand covered hers, his grip tight as he gave a wordless promise. Without another word, he turned and slipped into the shadows, vanishing as quietly as he had come. Lily's heart beat faster in her chest, the enormity of her actions taking root as she made her way toward the horses. It was time to act. Later, as Roland and his men were distracted by the details of their plan, Lily, with Jeb's help, set the wheels in motion. They sabotaged the supplies meant for the raid, cutting the ropes and spilling the contents of the wagons into the dirt, rendering them useless. It was a small thing, a single act of defiance, but it was a message that she was no longer willing to be a part of the destruction, no longer willing to follow blindly in the wake of violence. The fire crackled behind her as she moved swiftly back into the camp, her breath heavy with adrenaline. The men would not discover the sabotage until morning, but by then it would be too late. The damage was done. As the camp began to settle into uneasy sleep, Lily retreated to her tent, the weight of the night's actions heavy on her heart. She sat down by the fire, the warmth against her skin a small comfort in the vast emptiness of the desert night. The flames danced before her, casting fleeting shadows across the tent's canvas walls. In the quiet solitude, she pulled out her small leather journal, an old habit she had kept since childhood. The journal had become a space for her to release her thoughts, her feelings. It was the one place she could be honest with herself, where she could speak freely without fear of judgment or retaliation. She dipped the quill into the ink and began to write, her handwriting slow and deliberate. "I've made a choice tonight. I can no longer live this way. The life we've built here, this legacy of violence and chaos, has consumed us all. I can't help but feel that it has consumed me, too. I've watched as my heart has hardened, and I've watched as others have been torn apart by the same darkness. But tonight, something in me broke. I can no longer stand by and be complicit in this. I need a life where love and honor can coexist, a life where I am not shackled by the sins of the past." The words came easily now, flowing from her like a release she hadn't known she needed. She continued to write, her heart opening with each stroke of the pen, feeling lighter with every sentence. "I want more than this. I want a future where I can be free, where I can love without fear, where I am not bound to the law of the outlaws, and if I have to leave it all behind to find that, then I will. I will choose the life I want, even if it means walking away from everything I've known, even if it means breaking the bond I've shared with those I've called family." She set the quill down and closed the journal with a soft snap, her hands trembling slightly as she held it close to her chest. It was a small act of rebellion, a quiet declaration of her own worth, but it was enough to fuel the fire within her. She had chosen a different path, one that could lead to everything she had ever wanted, or nothing at all. But no matter the cost, she knew she had made the right choice. As she looked into the flickering fire, the weight of her decision settled over her like a cloak of resolve. Tomorrow, she would face whatever came next, but tonight, she could finally breathe. The world was changing, and for the first time in a long while, Lily Dalton felt like she was, too. The morning had come too quickly, dragging Elias out of a restless sleep, the weight of his decision still heavy on his shoulders. He had spent the night under the open sky, the wind sweeping through the trees as if nature itself were questioning him. As he rode through the dense forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world was both stretching out before him and closing in at once. His mind, sharp with uncertainty, wrestled with thoughts of what lay ahead. The land around him, wild and untamed, mirrored the turmoil inside his heart. He had taken this solitary journey, hoping for clarity, hoping for redemption, but all he had found were more questions. He was a man lost between duty and desire, between what was right and what he had allowed his heart to follow. He pulled his horse to a stop beside a stream, the gentle rush of the water a temporary relief to the chaos in his mind. The deep green of the trees and the cool scent of earth filled his senses, but there was no peace in the quiet, not yet. Elias dismounted, his muscles stiff from the long hours in the saddle. He dipped his hands into the cool stream, the icy water rushing over his fingers, sending a shock of relief up his arm. The chill seemed to reach into him, washing away the dust of the road, the sweat of the journey, the weight of his doubts. For a brief moment, he let himself feel the cleansing power of the water, like a renewal of sorts. As he washed his face, the coldness seemed to clear his head, but it was when he looked up that his world tilted once more. Standing in the distance, almost hidden by the trees, was a figure, a man who should have been Elias's ally, but instead had become a symbol of his faltering faith. It was Marshal Garrett, an old friend, someone Elias had trusted deeply in the past, but as the years had passed, Garrett's choices had begun to align more with his own ambitions than the law. Now Garrett's cold eyes met Elias's with no warmth, no recognition of the bond they once shared. "What are you doing out here, Elias?" Garrett's voice was a rough whisper, laced with distrust. "Thought you were a man of the law, not some drifter, running from the truth." Elias felt a twinge of disbelief, the sting of betrayal cutting deeper than he cared to admit. Garrett had always been a friend, a man who had stood beside him through thick and thin, but now, standing before him, Elias saw only the shadow of that man, the cracks that had formed in their friendship, the growing divide between them. "You don't get it, Garrett," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not running. I'm trying to do what's right. I'm trying to restore something that's been lost." He paused, his gaze darkening. "But I can't do it if the ones I trust turn their backs on me." Garrett's face twisted into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Trust?" He laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the stillness of the forest. "You're a fool, Elias. You think you can fix this mess? You think you can come back from the things you've done?" He stepped closer, his eyes glinting with malice. "You've lost your way. There's no going back." The words hit like a punch, knocking the breath out of Elias. He had thought Garrett's loyalty would hold. He had trusted him, believed in the friendship they had once shared, but in that moment Elias realized the painful truth. Garrett had never been the man he had thought him to be. His heart ached with the realization. He had been betrayed not just by Garrett, but by his own blind faith in people who were not worthy of it. But Elias wasn't the same man he had been when this journey began. He had ridden into the wilderness searching for answers, for redemption. But now he knew what he had to do. He had to move forward, no matter how heavy the burden. With a final disgusted glance at Garrett, Elias mounted his horse and spurred the animal forward, his heart hardening with resolve. This was his path now, his to walk, alone if necessary. Meanwhile, far from Elias's path, Lily sat in the center of the outlaw camp, her face pale, her eyes shadowed by sorrow. The camp had been abuzz with activity the night before, but now there was a somber quiet, the kind that only came after tragedy. Her older cousin Jake, one of the few people she had trusted in this life, had been killed during a raid that had gone horribly wrong. The news had come like a blow, the weight of his loss sinking into her chest with a grief she hadn't expected. She had known the risks, had accepted the violence that came with the life she had chosen, but that didn't make it easier. Jake had been like a brother to her, his laughter always filling the air around the fire, his presence a small comfort in a world so often filled with danger and death. Now that comfort was gone, snatched away in the blink of an eye. She stood by the fire, staring at the spot where Jake had fallen. The others had moved away, leaving her in the silence, and for the first time Lily felt the weight of the past pressing down on her. The choices she had made hanging over her like an anchor. She had chosen this life, she had accepted the dangers, but she hadn't prepared for the loss. How much more of this can I take? The thought echoed in her mind as she bent down, her fingers brushing the dirt where Jake had fallen. The dust clung to her skin, and for a brief moment she felt as though the earth itself was mocking her, reminding her of the life she had chosen, the life that had taken everything from her. But as she stood, wiping the dirt from her hands, something shifted inside her. The weight of Jake's loss wasn't the only thing she carried. She had her own dreams, her own desires for something better, something more than this endless cycle of violence. She could feel it burning deep inside her. She wasn't just the daughter of outlaws anymore. She was Lily Dalton, a woman who could choose her own path, and she would. Both Elias and Lily had faced moments that threatened to break them, moments that dug deep into their souls, but neither would be undone. Elias had suffered betrayal from an old friend, his trust shattered, but in the process he had found something stronger, his own resolve, his own understanding of the man he was now. Lily, too, had faced loss, but in the face of it she had found her own strength, her own vision of what her life could be. As the sun began to set on the horizon, both of them stood at the edge of something new. Elias, his path now defined by his choices, and Lily, her heart emboldened by the defiance that had come from within. They were both changed, their journeys apart drawing them closer to the moment when their paths would finally converge once more. For now the future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape, and with the first drops of rain beginning to fall, the earth beneath them cleansed by the storm, both Elias and Lily knew that they would rise stronger, no matter what the world had in store. Chapter 4. The Convergence. The twilight hours hung heavy over Dunwood, casting long dark shadows across the streets and the dusty earth beyond. A quiet unease had settled over the town, the kind that precedes a storm, both in the sky and in the heart. The air was thick with tension, as if the land itself was holding its breath. waiting for something to break the stillness. Elias McCready stood in the sheriff's office, his boots resting on the creaky floorboards, staring out the window at the fading light. The wind had picked up, carrying the promise of a coming storm. The sky was darkening rapidly, the first gusts of wind sending dust swirling in the streets. His thoughts, though, were far from the weather. They were on the events that had led him here, the choices he had made, and the price he would have to pay. Outside, in the growing darkness, a different kind of storm was brewing. A rival gang, the Blackthorn brothers, had been causing trouble in the area for months. Their reputation was built on violence and lawlessness, and they had set their sights on Dunwood. Word had reached Elias that they were closing in on the town, ready to plunder and destroy everything in their path. Elias had already sent word to the local militia, but he knew it might not be enough. The Blackthorn brothers weren't just a gang, they were an army of outlaws, and if they wanted to take Dunwood, they would do it with fire and blood. He paced the office, his hand resting on the worn grip of his revolver, when the sound of rapid hoofbeats reached his ears. He paused, listening. The sound grew louder, more frantic. It was a rider, coming in fast. The door to the sheriff's office burst open, and Sam Curtis, his face pale with urgency, stormed in. "Sheriff, they're coming! They're here! We've got no time to waste!" Elias's stomach tightened. The storm had arrived, and it wasn't just the weather. At the outskirts of the outlaw camp, Lily Dalton sat atop her horse, her eyes scanning the horizon. The camp was restless tonight. The news of the Blackthorn brothers' approach had reached them, and though the group was used to threats, there was something different about this one. The Blackthorn brothers were ruthless, and they didn't care who stood in their way. Lily had heard the stories, seen the damage left behind in other towns, and she knew that Dunwood was next on their list. Her gut twisted with uncertainty as she glanced back at Roland, who was rallying the group, preparing for whatever battle lay ahead. "You think we can take them?" Lily asked, her voice low but tinged with a rare hint of doubt. Roland looked at her with a grim expression. "If we fight smart, we stand a chance. If we fight foolishly, we die." Lily's heart pounded. She wasn't sure where her place was in all of this anymore. She had already risked so much for this life, for these people, but her conscience, her dreams for something more, pulled at her like a rope that was about to snap. She wanted to leave this world behind, but tonight she couldn't. There was still a part of her that believed in protecting the innocent, even if it meant fighting alongside the very people who had brought so much violence into her life. And so Lily found herself on the front lines once again, her mind torn between the person she had been and the one she wanted to be. The battle began with a single shot. The first of the Blackthorn brothers' riders broke through the trees, charging toward Dunwood with the full force of their gang behind them. The townspeople scattered and the militia fired back, but it was clear that they were outnumbered. Gunshots rang out, echoing through the town as the clash of worlds, the world of lawmen and the world of outlaws, collided in a violent storm. Elias McCready rode out with his deputies, his heart racing in his chest. He had trained for this. He had faced this kind of danger before. But as he looked at the oncoming riders, his mind wasn't just on the battle. It was on Lily. Where was she? What side would she be on? The answer came soon enough. Through the smoke and the chaos of the battlefield, Elias saw her, Lily, riding hard through the dust, a look of determination etched on her face as she charged into the fray. She wasn't just a bystander in this fight. She was part of it, fighting for the very town she had once threatened to tear apart. For a moment their eyes met across the battlefield and the world seemed to stop. The noise of gunfire, the shouts of men, the cries of pain, all of it faded away as they locked gazes. Elias's heart skipped a beat. She was here, right in the thick of it, and he couldn't help but feel a pull toward her. Despite everything, despite the worlds they had come from, they were standing together in this moment, side by side. A bullet tore through the air, snapping his focus back to the fight. He swerved his horse, barely avoiding the shot, and immediately turned his attention back to the chaos unfolding before him. The battle was fierce. The Blackthorn brothers were ruthless, their guns blazing as they pushed forward, but the town had a fighting spirit, and Elias was determined to defend it. Intercut with the frenetic gunfire and chaos, Elias and Lily's paths continued to intersect. They fought with shared precision, their movements in sync despite the odds stacked against them. Gunshots rang in their ears, but neither faltered. Elias fired from horseback, expertly picking off targets with a calmness that surprised even him. His mind, so often clouded with doubt, was now clear, focused entirely on the battle. Lily fought with equal ferocity, her heart pounding with adrenaline as she fired her own shots, helping to take down the Blackthorn brothers' men one by one. Her movements were sharp, practiced, and full of purpose. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of belonging, of doing something that mattered. They were drawn to each other in the chaos, like magnets in the storm, and as the battle raged on, they found themselves side by side once more. Their horses were close, their eyes meeting again across the smoke-filled battlefield. There was no time for words, no time for explanations, only the shared understanding that in this moment they were united by the fight before them. As the tide of battle turned, with the Blackthorn brothers retreating into the distance, Elias and Lily stood together in the aftermath. Their clothes were torn, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat, but they were both alive. The storm that had torn through Dunwood was fading, but the damage was done. Elias looked at Lily, his heart heavy with everything unsaid. She had defied her own world to fight for something greater, and for the first time he saw her not as an outlaw's daughter, but as a woman who had chosen to fight for the same things he had once believed in. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the town began to settle. The immediate danger had passed, but the cost was still evident in the wounded and the dead. Elias and Lily, two souls bound by circumstance, stood side by side in the fading light, their worlds collided, but their future uncertain. The battle was over, but the journey for both of them was just beginning. The sound of gunfire had begun to dull, replaced by the distant, agonized cries of the wounded and the echo of retreating footsteps. The battlefield was a mess of chaos, dust hanging in the air, the stench of gunpowder lingering like a heavy fog, and the clatter of hooves and boots. Elias McCready's heart still raced in his chest, and his hands were slick with sweat despite the cool evening breeze. The Blackthorn brothers had been relentless, but the town and its people had fought back with a ferocity Elias hadn't expected. He had seen the courage of the townsfolk, the will to protect their home burning bright in their eyes, but through it all, through the smoke and the sound of combat, there had been another presence at his side. Lily Dalton. She had fought just as fiercely as any man, and as the battle had turned in their favor, Elias couldn't help but admire her for it. Her courage was undeniable, but it was more than just her skill with a gun or her fierce determination. It was the fact that despite everything, the past, the bloodshed, the betrayals, she had chosen this moment. She had chosen to stand by him, to fight for what was right even when the cost was high. The ground beneath him was still hot with the aftermath of the battle. Bodies lay scattered in the dirt, some dead, some wounded, and others retreating in defeat. The town was battered, but they had held strong, and Elias knew they had won. But victory had come at a steep price. His thoughts drifted to the faces of those who had fought beside him, men and women alike, people who had trusted him when they could have run. The cost of that trust, of that courage, was something he would carry with him. As he scanned the battlefield, his eyes landed on her, Lily. She was standing near the fire, her face streaked with dirt, sweat clinging to her brow, but her eyes were unwavering, fixed on him as he approached. In that moment everything else faded, the shouts, the cries, the aftermath of violence. It all seemed far away. It was just the two of them again, like it had been when they had first met, but now with the weight of everything they had been through pressing between them. For a long, silent moment they stood there, eyes meeting in the fading light. Then, without a word, Elias nodded at her, a small but significant gesture. It was a silent promise, a vow that despite the pain of the past, despite the different worlds they came from, they had fought side by side. That connection had deepened between them, and in that nod, in that shared silence, something unspoken passed between them. Lily, her lips pressed into a tight line, gave a small nod back, her eyes reflecting the same quiet understanding. There were no words for what had just transpired between them, no need for them. Their bond had been forged in the fire of battle, and in this moment it was stronger than anything else they had experienced. It was a connection built on action, on trust, on fighting for something bigger than themselves. The world around them seemed to exhale a collective breath as the chaos began to ebb. The firelight flickered softly, and the last few Blackthorn brothers scattered, their retreating forms vanishing into the night. The sounds of battle were gradually replaced by the shuffling of soldiers tending to the wounded, the low murmur of people talking quietly among themselves. The air was still thick with the tension of what had just transpired, but there was something else there now. Something fragile, something that felt like the first hint of peace after a long, terrible storm. Elias stepped toward Lily, his boots crunching against the dirt as he approached her. She hadn't moved, hadn't looked away, and for a brief moment they both stood still, acknowledging the aftermath of what they had just done together. He was no longer just the lawman who had once looked at her as an enemy. She was no longer just an outlaw's daughter, a symbol of the chaos he had tried to protect his town from. In this moment they were equals, both shaped by the choices they had made, both scarred by the battle, but stronger for it. "We did it," Elias said, his voice rough from the dust and the battle. The words seemed inadequate for everything they had just survived, but it was all he could offer. The victory felt hollow without the town fully healed, without those they had lost. Lily's gaze softened, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find the words too. "We did," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched in her face. "I didn't think we'd make it." Elias smiled, though the expression was tired. "Neither did I." They both turned toward the town, the flickering lights of the buildings in the distance now visible in the dimming twilight. They had saved Dunwood, but the cost had been high, and the rebuilding of both the town and of themselves would take time. And yet Elias could feel something shifting within him, something that had been lost, something he thought was gone forever. The weight of his badge no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a purpose, like something he had chosen to fight for, not because it was expected of him, but because it was the right thing to do. He had learned that much, and Lily had been part of that lesson. Lily, too, had found something deeper within herself during the fight. She had always known the price of loyalty, the price of survival, but standing there now, having faced the consequences of her choices, she realized that she could rebuild. She could be more than just the daughter of outlaws. She could be someone who fought for what was right, even if it meant standing in the fire. Even if it meant walking away from the life she had known. And in this moment, they shared something more than just a battle won. They shared a quiet understanding, a shared strength that had been built through sacrifice, trust, and the willingness to fight for each other and for something bigger than themselves. Elias turned to her then, his voice low, the weight of the moment heavy in his chest. "We can do this," he said, the words carrying the promise of something more. Together. Lily's heart clenched as she met his gaze, the weight of their shared experiences binding them in ways she hadn't fully understood until now. There would be no easy answers, no quick fixes, but this moment was the first step toward something new, for both of them. The battle was over, but the journey they had begun together was just beginning. The sounds of gunfire and chaos had finally died down, leaving behind the sharp, acrid scent of smoke and the low murmurs of people moving through the debris. The town of Dunwood, its streets now littered with the remnants of battle, felt like a place caught between two worlds. The world it had once been, and the one it had been forced into. The horizon, still dimming with the fading light of day, cast long shadows across the scarred landscape. A few stray embers still glowed in the distance where the fire had burned hottest, but the worst of the fighting was over. Now there was only the aftermath. Elias Macready sat on a boulder at the edge of the town square, his elbows resting on his knees, his face shadowed by fatigue. He hadn't expected the battle to take so much out of him, not physically, but emotionally. The cost had been high, the price of survival etched into the faces of the men and women around him, those who had fought alongside him and those who had been caught in the middle. The sun was setting, casting the town in a golden light that felt almost foreign against the ruins surrounding them. The dust that had settled over the land was thick, clinging to every surface. Elias ran a hand through his hair, pushing it back from his forehead as he exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the wreckage. For a brief moment he allowed himself to take in the quiet. No more gunfire, no more shouting. just the sounds of people tending to the wounded, their voices soft with concern as they began to pick up the pieces. It was a strange calm, fragile but somehow filled with potential. His gaze lifted to the figure standing a few paces away, looking out over the wreckage with the same weary, thoughtful expression that mirrored his own. It was Lily. She had fought beside him. No, she had fought for him as much as she had fought for herself. And as much as Elias had wanted to avoid this union, this connection, he knew now that it was inevitable. They were bound by the battle they had fought together, and whatever their paths had been before, they had collided here in the dust and blood of this moment. Lily turned, her eyes meeting his across the distance. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, something that spoke of quiet relief, but it was tempered with a trace of the uncertainty they both carried. The battle was over, but the war, for their hearts, for their futures, was just beginning. Elias stood, his body stiff with exhaustion as he walked toward her. His boots kicked up the dust with every step, but he didn't mind. The dust would settle eventually, it always did. He stopped just in front of her, close enough to feel the warmth of her body, but still distant enough to feel the chasm between them. "Is it over?" she asked softly, her voice like the wind, carrying the weight of everything they had both been through. She didn't look at him directly. Instead, she focused on the town behind her, the people working to rebuild. But her question wasn't just about the battle. It was about them too. Elias nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the street behind her. "For now. But it's never really over, is it? Not with the way things are." Lily shifted, her fingers tracing a small groove in the stone beneath her hand. She looked down, the dust of the town and the blood of the fallen mixing into a single, indelible image. "No," she agreed, "it's never over. But we can change it. We can make something new from all this destruction. We can rebuild just like the town will." Elias let out a slow breath, the weight of her words settling over him. She had always been strong, but something about her quiet resolve in this moment struck him deeper than anything he'd ever seen in her before. She wasn't just an outlaw's daughter anymore. She was a woman who had seen the consequences of the choices they'd both made. She was a woman who had decided to fight for something more than survival. "I don't know how we'll make it work," Elias said, his voice low. "The town still sees me as a lawman, and you, well, you're still an outlaw. The rift between us, between the law and the outlaws, is too deep. It might be too deep for anything we can do to heal it." Lily's eyes flicked to his, her gaze steady and determined. "Maybe it is, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe it's about trying anyway. Maybe it's about showing them that there's another way, that we can be more than just what the world expects of us." Elias didn't speak immediately. He could feel the weight of her words pressing against the edge of his heart. There was something in them, something that rang true. He had always believed that the line between right and wrong was clear, that the law was an unmovable thing. But standing here now with Lily at his side, he realized that maybe the world wasn't as clear-cut as he had thought. Maybe there was room for something else, for redemption, for understanding, for a new kind of justice. Lily turned toward him fully now, her shoulders squared, her hands resting lightly on her hips. The sun behind her bathed her in a soft, almost ethereal light, and for a moment, Elias felt as if he were seeing her for the first time. Not as the daughter of outlaws, not as the woman who had defied him at every turn, but as someone who had chosen to stand beside him, to fight beside him. "We've both lost a lot," she said, her voice quieter now. "But maybe we don't have to lose each other. Maybe this," she gestured vaguely toward the town, toward the smoke, toward everything they had just survived, "can be the beginning of something better." Elias swallowed hard, his throat tight as he looked at her. For the first time since he had met her, the bitterness and doubt that had always clouded his thoughts seemed to lift, if only for a moment. He could see the possibility in her words, a possibility that, despite everything, they could create something new. Together. "I don't know what the future holds, Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I know this. I'm willing to fight for it. With you, if you'll have me." Lily smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. I don't think I've ever been more certain of anything in my life." The world around them still felt uncertain, fragile even. But in that moment, as they stood together in the fading light, Elias knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The past had shaped them, but it didn't have to define them. Their future was theirs to create, and together they would forge something stronger, something more. And as the night began to fall, the promise of that future hung in the air between them, a delicate thread that could never be broken. Chapter 5. Redemption and Reunion. The first light of dawn spread across the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold as the sun's rays broke through the morning mist. The town of Dunwood, once teeming with the sounds of battle and chaos, now lay still beneath the gentle light of a new day. The streets, still stained with dust and blood, seemed quieter than before, as though even the land itself was recovering from the violence it had witnessed. Elias McGrady stood at the window of the sheriff's office, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of the rising sun. His eyes, though tired, took in the sight of the town, its buildings standing resilient amidst the ruin, its people slowly emerging from the shadows of fear. The aftermath of the battle had left its scars on both the land and its inhabitants, but there was a quiet strength in the air now, a strength that had not been there before. The immediate threat had passed, and for the first time in days Elias felt the weight of exhaustion settle in his bones. His hand rested on the edge of the window, his fingers tracing the familiar grooves of the worn wood. The town was safe, for now, but what had it cost? What had the battle and the loss of life done to the fragile threads of trust between law and outlaw? His thoughts turned inward, the emotional wounds just as sharp as the physical ones. His chest still ached where he had been grazed by a bullet, though the pain was more of a dull throb now. The bandage around his side was stained, and his clothes, torn from the fight, hung loosely on his frame. But it wasn't the physical wounds that weighed heaviest on him, it was the uncertainty of what came next. The trust he had once taken for granted had been shattered. And now, with the dust of the battle settling, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about honor, about law, and about what it meant to fight for the right reasons. On the small desk in front of him lay his sheriff's badge, its silver surface dull from the dust of battle. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The weight of it in his palm was familiar, but it no longer felt like the symbol of the man he had once been. He had worn this badge with pride, believing it to be his duty to uphold justice and keep the peace. But now, it felt more like a relic of a past life, one that was slipping further and further away. Elias turned the badge over in his hand, the cool metal grounding him, as if it could somehow reconnect him to the man he had been before the war had come to town, before the divisions had grown deeper than he had ever imagined. His eyes flickered to the photo on the corner of his desk. The photograph of his father, the man who had first pinned that badge on his chest, proud and full of hope. The memories surged within him, and with them came the bitter realization that his father's world, where right and wrong were clear and unshakable, no longer existed in the world Elias had inherited. It was a world full of compromise, of gray areas where the law was not as simple as a badge and a gun. With a deep, steadying breath, Elias set the badge back on the desk, his fingers lingering for a moment longer before he turned away. He had fought for Dunwood, fought for what he believed was right, but now, as the town began to heal, so too did he. The scar of the past would remain, but perhaps there was room for something new. As the sun climbed higher, Elias left the office, stepping out into the warmth of the day. His boots crunched against the dirt street, and, as he looked around, he could see the town coming to life. People were beginning to clear the debris, to rebuild the buildings that had been damaged, to tend to the wounded. It was slow work, but it was progress, and for the first time in a long while, Elias allowed himself to feel something close to hope. He caught sight of Lily in the distance, her back to him as she helped a group of townsfolk rebuild a collapsed wall. She was just as much a part of this healing as anyone, and though the past still lingered between them, the bond they had forged in the fire of battle remained unbroken. Elias knew now that whatever came next, they would face it together. But there was more work to be done, not just for the town, but for them both. The town hall was crowded with townspeople, all of them gathered in the same room for the first time since the battle. It was a mixture of tension and hope in the air, an odd stillness, as if everyone were holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Elias stood near the front, his stance rigid but his expression thoughtful. Beside him stood Lily, her eyes calm but intense, her posture speaking volumes about her determination to be a part of the town's healing process, despite the history she carried with her. The town had been divided, law and outlaw, justice and survival. But the battle had proven that they were all just people, caught in a world that demanded more of them than they had been willing to give. Now, in the aftermath, it was time for something different. It was time for healing. Elias stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "We've been through hell," he began, the words carrying the weight of his experiences. "But we've made it through. We've fought together, and now it's time to rebuild not just our homes, but our community. The law may be hard, but it's not an enemy. We're all part of this, all of us." His eyes scanned the room, making contact with the men and women who had been the hardest to reach, the ones who still held tight to old grudges, old wounds. He could see it in their eyes, the reluctance, the hesitation. But there was something else there, too, something softer, something that spoke of possibility. Lily stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room with quiet strength. "This town, this place, it's more than just land and buildings, it's people. We all have a part in that, we all have a role to play, and we can't keep fighting each other and expect the world to change. I'm here to help, to show that there is another way, a way to rebuild." Her words landed with surprising force, and for a moment the room was silent. No one spoke, but the shift was visible. The divide wasn't gone. It never would be, but in that moment it felt a little smaller, a little less insurmountable. One of the older men from the town, his face weathered and stern, stood up. He walked toward Lily, his steps slow but deliberate. When he reached her, he extended a hand. "We've fought each other for too long," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Maybe it's time we work together." Lily took his hand without hesitation, and as their hands clasped, there was a quiet release in the room, a sense of something new, something hopeful, beginning to take shape. One by one, others followed, stepping forward with the same intention, to mend what had been broken. Handshakes were exchanged, quiet words of understanding shared. For the first time in a long while, the air in the room felt lighter. The town was beginning to heal, piece by piece. But more than that, Elias and Lily were beginning to heal, too. They weren't the same people they had been when they first met, when the divisions between them were insurmountable. But now their worlds had come together, forged in the fire of the battle they had fought, not just for Dunwood, but for each other. As the town slowly returned to life, the promise of a future built on trust, on unity, began to take root. And though Elias knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, he had Lily by his side. And that, more than anything, was the beginning of something he hadn't dared hope for. Redemption. Together, they had found it. The evening was still, the sky a tapestry of stars that stretched endlessly above them. The air had cooled after the heat of the day, and a quiet breeze whispered through the trees surrounding the small cabin that stood at the edge of town. The cabin was modest, a symbol of the new beginnings that had taken root in the heart of both Dunwood and its people. Yet, in the midst of it all, it was the simplicity of the moment, the calm after the storm, that filled Elias with a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. Elias stood outside, just at the threshold of the door, his eyes lifted to the heavens. The stars shimmered above him like ancient beacons, their light soft and far away, yet somehow reassuring. It felt like the world had paused for this moment, like everything that had come before had been leading him here, to this quiet place, to this point in time. His hand rested against the doorframe, and as he breathed in the cool night air, his thoughts drifted. The fight for Dunwood, the battles they had fought, both external and within themselves, had brought them to this precipice. It had been a long road, full of uncertainty, pain, and sacrifice, but now, in this moment, there was a flicker of hope, a glimmer of something more. The soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path broke his reverie. He turned, and there she was, Lily. Her presence seemed to fill the air with a warmth that had little to do with the heat of the day or the flickering lanterns on the porch. She was standing a few paces away, her silhouette framed by the soft light from the cabin. her face a mixture of quiet strength and something else, something deeper. Lily met his gaze, her eyes bright under the stars. She had changed since that first moment they had crossed paths, and he saw it in the way she stood now, more sure of herself, more willing to face the consequences of her choices. Her journey, too, had led her here, to this space between them, and Elias knew that she had come as far as he had. The silence between them was comfortable, but it was not enough, not anymore. There were words that needed to be spoken, truths that needed to be shared. "You're here," Elias said softly, his voice low but filled with something that neither of them had been able to articulate before. "I am," Lily replied, taking a slow step forward. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. "I've been trying to figure out where I belong in all this. All of it. The battles, the choices, the town, you—" She paused, looking down at the ground for a brief moment before meeting his gaze again. "I'm here because I know where I belong now. With you." The words landed between them like a quiet truth. Elias could feel the weight of them, but also the warmth of something new, something fragile but undeniable. It wasn't just the physical distance that had closed between them over the course of the battle. It was the emotional one. They had fought together, survived together, and now they were ready to face whatever came next. Together. Elias took a step closer to her, his breath shallow, as if the very proximity of her presence was enough to stir emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel fully. "I'm not sure what the future holds, Lily. I'm not sure what it means to be with someone like me, a lawman, a man who has seen so much and who has done so much." Lily's expression softened, her hand reaching up as if to touch his arm, but she stopped just short, her fingers hovering. "And what about me?" she asked quietly. "The daughter of outlaws, a woman who has fought for survival all her life? What do you see when you look at me?" He hesitated, his chest tightening with the weight of everything unsaid. "I see you, the woman who has stood beside me, the woman who has chosen to fight for what's right, even when the world said it was impossible. You've shown me that things don't have to be as simple as the law or the past." Her breath caught in her throat, and she took another step closer, closing the distance between them until their feet were nearly touching. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know it hasn't been easy, for either of us, but we've both had to face our fears, and I think we've both been afraid of what it might cost us to really stand together. But I'm not afraid anymore. Not of you, not of us." The night seemed to hold its breath as the words settled between them, and in that moment, Elias knew. He had been afraid of losing himself, afraid of the sacrifice it would take to bridge the gap between law and outlaw. But Lily had shown him that there was more to life than just surviving. There was living, there was loving, and there was the possibility of something better, something built not on past mistakes, but on the future they could create together. Elias reached for her then, his hand moving to her cheek, brushing the back of his fingers lightly against her skin. Her warmth, her presence, was a balm to the rawness inside him. He cupped her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw, and for the first time in a long while, Elias let himself truly feel everything he had been holding back. "I'm scared too," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Scared of what we've done, what we'll face. But I want to face it with you. I want to build something better, even if it's hard. Even if it means starting from scratch." Lily smiled then, a quiet, knowing smile that softened her features. She reached up, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever comes next, we'll do it together." In that moment, the distance between them vanished. Everything they had been through, every hardship and every tear had led them to this, a fragile, quiet connection that promised something more. The world outside might still be uncertain, still scarred by the battles they had fought, but here, in this space between them, there was only peace. There was only the quiet strength of their bond, unspoken yet understood. And then, as the stars above them twinkled brightly in the clear night sky, Elias pulled her into his arms. Their embrace was slow, tentative at first, but it grew deeper as they held each other, as if they were both saying without words everything they had ever needed to say. The warmth of her body, the steady rhythm of her breathing settled the ache in his chest. They held each other there, beneath the quiet, starlit sky, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. In this moment there was no longer a divide, only the promise of a new beginning, built on the strength of their shared journey and the love that had bloomed between them in the midst of it all. Chapter 6. New Beginnings on the Frontier. The early morning sun cast a soft golden glow over the town of Dunwood, its light dappling the freshly painted buildings and glinting off the windows that had been repaired in the weeks since the battle. A light breeze stirred the dust in the streets, but it was a breeze that seemed to carry with it something more, a promise of renewal, a breath of fresh air after the suffocating weight of uncertainty. The town had transformed just as the people had in the wake of the destruction. The buildings that had once stood battered and worn, their foundations cracked by the weight of battle, now stood tall and proud. The storefronts had been patched and painted, their signs freshly restored, and the once barren street corners were now alive with activity. The dry, cracked earth had given way to the green shoots of new life as the town began to rebuild itself, not just physically, but emotionally. From the edge of town, the view was peaceful, almost idyllic. The sun glinted off the new roofs of the saloon and the mercantile, and the streets, once empty and desolate, were now alive with the sounds of people working together, fixing, repairing, and creating a new future. The laughter of children echoed through the air as they played in the square, while men and women of all ages worked together to plant gardens, repair fences, and bring back the life that had been so nearly lost. Elias Macready stood at the edge of the town, looking out over the scene with a sense of quiet pride. His heart, still tender from the battles he had fought, not just with the Blackthorn brothers, but within himself, was lighter now. The town was healing, and so was he. It had been a slow process, but the changes were tangible now. The fear and distrust that had once hung heavy over the town were dissipating. The people who had once eyed him warily, uncertain of his intentions, now offered him nods of respect as he passed. The sheriff's badge, which had once felt like an unbearable weight, now felt like a symbol of duty he could wear with pride. The people had come together, and the division between law and outlaw had begun to blur, the boundaries between them softened by the collective effort of rebuilding something better. He watched as men and women worked side by side, their conversations light, filled with laughter and new ideas. The old rifts were slowly healing, the distrust fading like the last remnants of a storm. Even the street itself seemed to reflect the change. Fresh paint on the storefronts, new shutters on the windows, and the sound of tools as they worked to fix the damage done during the turmoil. Lily stood beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. She had been a part of this transformation just as much as he had. Her hands, still rough from the work she had done alongside the townsfolk, rested on her hips as she looked at the scene. "This place," she said, her voice soft with a mixture of disbelief and pride. "It's come back to life." Elias glanced over at her, meeting her gaze with a smile that spoke of shared understanding. "We have," he said quietly, "but it's not just about rebuilding buildings, it's about rebuilding trust, building something that lasts." Lily nodded, her eyes following the townsfolk as they worked together. "When we first arrived, it felt like everything was broken, like there was no hope left for this town, but now it's different." She was right. The town had come through the darkness, had weathered the storm together, and now it was a place where people believed in the future again. The harsh realities of life on the frontier were always there, lurking just beneath the surface, but the spirit of the people, their willingness to stand together in the face of adversity, was what had truly rebuilt Dunwood. Elias looked out over the town, his hand resting on his side where the wound from the battle still ached. He could feel the weight of the past lifting even as he continued to carry the memories of what they had lost. But those memories were now tempered by the knowledge that the town had survived. They had all survived. In the distance, a group of townsfolk were gathering around the newly repaired general store, laughing and talking as they exchanged goods and stories. A child ran past, a kite trailing behind her in the wind, and for a moment the entire town seemed to exhale in unison. A collective sigh of relief, of hope. The pain of the past was still there, but it was no longer the defining force. The future, uncertain as it always was now a place they could look toward with optimism. "This," Lily said, her voice low but filled with meaning, "this is what we fought for. This is what we can build together." Elias turned to her, the intensity of her words settling into his chest like a promise. He knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face them. The town needed him, and he needed them. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "We can rebuild, and we will, together." Lily gave him a small smile, her hand brushing against his arm. "We've already begun." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the people of Dunwood continued their work, a sense of unity in their every movement. It was a new day, a new beginning, and the town was ready for whatever came next, and so was Elias. And so was Lily. Together they would face the future, no longer divided by the past, but united in the promise of a new frontier. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the town of Dunwood. The streets, once scarred and broken by the ravages of the recent battle, now hummed with activity, healing, growing, and thriving. It was a new dawn for this frontier town, and at the heart of it stood Elias Macready. No longer just the sheriff, but a leader in the truest sense of the word. As he stood at the front of the newly constructed town hall, Elias surveyed the crowd with a quiet pride. The men and women who had once hesitated to follow him, who had questioned his role in their lives, now looked to him for guidance. There was no doubt in his mind that the respect he had earned in battle was a far cry from the respect he had earned by leading them into the future. The town was beginning to lay the foundations for something lasting, something that would ensure their survival, not just through the next crisis, but for the generations to come. They had set up a justice board, a civic group made up of equal parts lawmen, townsfolk, and former outlaws, who would work together to resolve disputes and maintain order. A community watch had been established to keep the peace, and the beginnings of a public works program, repaving roads, building bridges, and improving the town's infrastructure, had already taken root. Elias, one of the town's elders, an older man named Jonah, called to him from the back of the room. "What do you think? The board is ready to meet?" Elias straightened, his hand on the table in front of him. He turned to face Jonah, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "It's what this town needs. We've fought together, and now we need to work together to build a future. This isn't just about law and order. It's about making sure everyone has a chance to thrive, no matter where they came from." Jonah nodded, his eyes filled with the weight of their shared history. "You've got the right idea, Elias. The board can't just be about keeping the peace. It has to be about building something better. The future's in your hands now." Elias's heart clenched at the words, but he didn't flinch. The future of Dunwood, its prosperity, its very soul, was tied to his choices now. He would lead them, but he knew it wasn't just his voice they needed to hear. It was the voices of the community, of people who had learned through fire and hardship how to trust each other, how to rebuild. Meanwhile, in a small building not far from the town hall, Lily Dalton was hard at work, though it wasn't the same kind of work that had once defined her. She was no longer the outlaw's daughter, helping run schemes or hiding from the law. Now she was organizing aid for families who had fallen on hard times since the battle. She worked with women from all walks of life, teaching them how to make do, how to stretch what little they had, how to find hope in the smallest of tasks. As she sat at a small table with a group of women, her hands were steady as she sorted through the collection of clothes and food that had been donated for those in need. Her movements were purposeful, her demeanor kind but firm. She was no longer a symbol of rebellion. She was a symbol of hope. "This town needs all of us," Lily said, her voice low but filled with conviction as she looked around at the women working beside her. "We all have something to give, whether it's a little bit of food, a helping hand, or even just your time. It matters." One of the younger women, a new mother whose husband had been injured during the fight, looked at Lily with gratitude in her eyes. "You've changed so much, Lily," she said softly. "I remember when you first came here all those months ago. We didn't know what to make of you, but now, you're the one showing us how to rebuild." Lily smiled softly, her heart warmed by the words. "We all change, don't we?" she said quietly, her gaze drifting toward the window where the sun was beginning to set. We all have to find our place in the world, and sometimes that place is one we never expected to find. Lily's transformation was just as profound as the town's. She had learned to channel the courage and tenacity she had once used to survive into something far more meaningful. She was no longer living for herself or for the next fight. She was living for others, for the future, for the legacy she would leave behind. Later, Elias and Lily found themselves standing together on the steps of the town hall. The sun had set, casting the town in a warm, soft glow. It was quiet now, the sounds of children playing and adults working slowly fading into the evening. There was a peace in the air that they hadn't known before, a peace that was hard-earned but well worth the effort. Lily stood next to Elias, her eyes scanning the horizon, a sense of satisfaction in her posture. She looked at him, her voice quiet but filled with pride. "You've done it. The town is standing again." Elias turned to look at her, a soft smile on his face. "We've done it," he corrected. "It's not just me. It's all of us, working together." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the last of the daylight faded from the sky. The air was cool now, the stars beginning to twinkle overhead. It was a peaceful scene, one that Elias had never dared to dream of. A town rebuilt, a community strong, and a future filled with possibility. "We've got a long road ahead of us," Elias said, his voice low. "But I'm ready. I'm ready to face it with you." Lily turned to him, her eyes soft but determined. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Elias. We'll face it together. Whatever comes, we'll build it, together." They stood side by side, surveying the town that they had both worked to heal. The horizon stretched out before them, endless and full of promise. The following evening, just before dusk, Elias and Lily made their way to the outskirts of town. The path leading up to the high ridge had become familiar to them, the place where they could sit quietly and look out over the expansive frontier. As they climbed, the sun sank lower in the sky, painting the plains in shades of orange, gold, and purple. The land stretched out before them, vast, untamed, and full of possibilities. They reached the top of the ridge, where a large rock formation provided a perfect vantage point. They sat down, their backs resting against the cool stone, and looked out over the horizon. The open plains were endless, and for a moment they allowed themselves to simply breathe, to be present in the peace that had finally settled over the land. Elias glanced at Lily, her face bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Her expression was one of quiet contentment, the weight of the past finally lifted from her shoulders. There was a strength in her now that hadn't been there before, a strength born of her journey, of her commitment to the town, to their shared future. "This is it," Elias said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. "This is where we begin, not just the town, but us, together." Lily's gaze shifted to meet his, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the moment. "We've come a long way," she said softly. "From where we were to here, and we're just getting started." Elias nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "This is our future now," he said, his words carrying the weight of everything they had overcome. "A future we'll build, together." As the last of the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, the stars began to appear, their light filling the sky with endless possibilities. Elias and Lily sat side by side, their hands lightly touching as they looked out over the land they would now protect, nurture, and build. A land full of hope, a land full of promise. And for the first time, Elias McCready truly believed that the future was theirs to shape. Together, the end.